Welcome, dear travelers of the night, to Mystic Bedtime Stories, where ancient worlds unfold in whispered tales beneath starlit skies. I'm your gentle guide through the corridors of time, here to accompany you on journeys to forgotten lands and civilizations that once breathed life into our world's earliest chapters. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed, feel the weight of the day slowly lifting from your shoulders. Close your eyes if you wish, and let your breathing find its natural rhythm. Tonight, we venture far beyond the familiar stories of Greece and Rome, beyond even the towering ziggurats of Babylon, to discover a civilization that has remained largely hidden in history's shadows, a land whose very name whispers mysteries across 4,000 years. This is the story of Elam, the enigmatic kingdom that flourished in the mountains and valleys of what we now call Iran, long before the Persian Empire rose to change the world. Picture, if you can, a realm where ancient rivers carved fertile valleys between weathered peaks, where Bronze Age craftsmen shaped vessels of extraordinary beauty, and where kings and queens ruled from palaces whose foundations still lie buried beneath layers of sand and time. As we begin this evening's journey together, allow yourself to drift with me across the vast expanse of centuries. Feel the cool night air as it might have moved through the date palms of ancient Susa, carrying with it the distant sound of temple bells and the gentle murmur of a civilization that once stood as equals with the great powers of Mesopotamia. The Elamites, as they came to be known, were neither fully of the East nor West, but something altogether unique, a bridge between worlds, speaking a language unlike any other, worshiping gods whose names have been whispered into silence, yet whose influence shaped the very foundations of what would become the Persian Empire and all that followed. Tonight, over the course of our gentle journey, we will walk through dusty marketplaces where merchants from distant lands bargained for precious metals and exotic spices. We will stand in the shadows of great temples dedicated to Inshushinak, the god of Susa, and witness the rise and fall of dynasties that once commanded respect from the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of Babylon. But first, let us travel back to the very beginning, to a time when the world was younger and the boundaries between myth and memory had not yet hardened into the history we know today. Let us journey to the land before Persia, to the valleys and highlands where the Elamite people first learned to work bronze, to write their mysterious script, and to build cities that would endure for millennia. Take a deep breath now and feel yourself settling more deeply into rest. The story of Elam is not one of rushing conquest or thunderous battles, though these too have their place in our tale. Rather, it is the story of a people who understood the art of endurance, who adapted and survived through changing seasons of power, who left behind artifacts of such beauty and mystery that archaeologists today still puzzle over their meaning. As you listen tonight, you may find your mind drifting like a gentle breeze across the ancient landscape we're about to explore. This is perfectly natural and exactly as it should be. Let the images form and dissolve in your consciousness like clouds moving across an evening sky. Some details will catch your attention, others will float by like distant music, and all of it will weave together into the peaceful tapestry of rest that your mind and body are seeking. So close your eyes now, if they aren't closed already, and prepare to step across the threshold of time. We're about to discover a civilization that existed at the very crossroads of the ancient world, where East met West long before anyone had named these directions. where the echoes of their achievements still resonate in the archaeological sites that dot the modern landscape of Iran. Chapter 1: The Land Before Persia. 10 minutes. In the beginning, long before the name of Cyrus the Great would echo across the known world, long before the golden halls of Persepolis would rise from the dusty plateau, there was a land of extraordinary beauty and strategic importance that lay like a jewel between the mountains and the rivers of Western Asia. This was Elam, and to understand its people, we must first understand the land that shaped them. Imagine, as you rest there in comfort, a vast panorama unfolding before you like a living map drawn by the hand of nature itself. To the east rise the formidable peaks of the Zagros Mountains, their snow-capped summits catching the first light of dawn and the last glow of sunset. These mountains were more than mere barriers. They were the backbone of Elam, providing protection, precious metals, and the clear streams that would nurture the valleys below. Below these mountains, spreading westward like a green carpet, lay the fertile plains of Khuzestan. Here, where the mountains gradually gave way to flatland, ancient rivers meandered through soil so rich that even today, 4 millennia later, it remains some of the most productive agricultural land in the Middle East. The largest of these rivers, which the ancients called the Karun, flowed with the steady patience of eternity, carrying life-giving water and fertile silt from the highlands to the lowlands, just as the Nile did for Egypt, just as the Euphrates and Tigris did for Mesopotamia. But unlike Egypt with its desert barriers, or Mesopotamia with its challenging terrain, Elam occupied a position that was both a blessing and a curse. Picture yourself standing on a high plateau, looking out over this ancient landscape. To your west, the great civilization of Mesopotamia beckons with its city-states, its cuneiform writing, and its sophisticated culture. To your north and east, the vast Iranian plateau stretches away toward horizons where other peoples are learning to domesticate horses and work iron. To your south, the Persian Gulf glimmers in the distance, offering routes to India and the lands beyond. This was Elam's eternal dilemma and its greatest opportunity. The land was blessed with natural highways that connected vastly different worlds, making it a crossroads for trade, ideas, and unfortunately, for armies. Caravans laden with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan would rest in Elamite cities. Mesopotamian merchants would negotiate in Elamite markets for the precious metals that came down from the Zagros peaks. And through it all, the Elamite people developed their own unique response to this constant flow of outside influence. They became, in essence, cultural translators. They learned to speak the languages of their neighbors while maintaining their own. They adopted useful technologies while preserving their own traditions. They worshipped some foreign gods while keeping faith with their ancestral deities. This gift for synthesis, for taking the best from many sources while remaining distinctly themselves, would become one of Elam's most remarkable characteristics. The climate of this ancient land was gentler than the harsh extremes of Mesopotamian summers or the bitter mountain winters. In the valleys where the great Elamite cities would rise, date palms provided shade and sustenance, their fronds rustling in warm breezes that carried the scent of jasmine and the distant hint of mountain snow. Springs bubbled up from the earth with water so pure that they would become sacred sites, places where temples were built and where pilgrims would come to seek healing and divine guidance. As you envision this landscape, let your mind's eye follow one of those ancient rivers downstream, past groves of pomegranate trees, heavy with ruby fruit. Past fields where barley and wheat grew tall and golden under the beneficent sun. Along the riverbanks, you would have seen the first permanent settlements of the Elamite people. Small at first, little more than collections of mud brick houses clustered around wells or near river fords. But even these early settlements showed signs of something special. Archaeological evidence suggests that from the very beginning, the people of this region possessed an aesthetic sense that set them apart. They painted their pottery with intricate geometric designs. They carved seals from hard stone with images of animals and abstract symbols that speak of a complex spiritual life. They buried their dead with care and ceremony, surrounding them with objects that suggest belief in an afterlife, in continued existence beyond the visible world. It's in these earliest layers of archaeological evidence that we first glimpse the mystery that would define Elam throughout its long history. These were clearly a sophisticated people, yet their sophistication was unlike that of any other ancient civilization we know. Their art was beautiful, but followed patterns that were uniquely their own. Their religion was complex, but centered on deities whose names and stories were written in a script that scholars today still struggle to fully understand. The land itself seemed to encourage this unique development. Unlike the river valleys of Egypt and Mesopotamia, which imposed certain patterns of life through their flooding cycles and agricultural demands, the varied landscape of Elam offered multiple possibilities. A tribe might choose to settle in the fertile lowlands and become farmers. Another might prefer the mountain valleys and become herders. Still others might position themselves along trade routes and become merchants. This diversity within unity would become a hallmark of Elamite civilization. As night deepens around you now, and as your breathing grows even more relaxed, picture yourself as a traveler in that ancient landscape. You are walking along one of those clear mountain streams, following it down from the high places toward the valley, where one of the first great Elamite cities will someday stand. The path is easy beneath your feet, worn smooth by countless other travelers over countless years. Above you, stars are beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that guided ancient caravans across the desert, the same constellations that Elamite priests would study to determine the most auspicious times for planting and harvest. Feel the gentle warmth rising from the earth around you, the warmth of a land that has been home to human civilization for thousands upon thousands of years. Breathe in the clean air, scented with wild herbs and the distant promise of rain in the mountains. This is the land that shaped the Elamite people. And in understanding it, we begin to understand them. Tomorrow, in the bright morning light of history, this landscape would witness the rise of one of humanity's most intriguing civilizations. But tonight, it sleeps under ancient stars, dreaming perhaps of all that is to come. As the first pale light of dawn touches the peaks of the Zagros Mountains in our imagination, we find ourselves stepping deeper into the mists of prehistory, to a time when the very foundations of Elamite civilization were being laid by hands we can no longer name, in settlements whose original names have been lost to the silence of millennia. Let yourself drift back now, back beyond the reach of written history, to around 5,000 years before the birth of Christ. In your mind's eye, you are floating gently above that fertile landscape we explored together, but now you are seeing it as it was in humanity's distant youth. The great cities have not yet been built. The mighty kings whose names would one day be carved in stone have not yet been born. Yet already something remarkable is beginning to stir in this land between the mountains and the rivers. In small villages scattered across the valleys, people are learning to do more than simply survive. They are beginning to create beauty for its own sake, to ask questions about the nature of the world around them, to develop the complex social structures that would eventually blossom into one of the ancient world's most fascinating civilizations. Archaeological evidence, painstakingly gathered by modern scholars from sites across southwestern Iran, tells us a story that reads like a gentle awakening in layers of earth that have remained undisturbed for 5,000 years. We find pottery of extraordinary sophistication. These are not the crude vessels of a primitive people learning to work with clay for the first time. Instead, they are elegant, thin-walled pieces decorated with intricate patterns that speak of artistic traditions already centuries old. Picture one such vessel in your mind as you rest there in comfort. It is a graceful bowl, its curves as pleasing to the eye as those of vessels that would be created thousands of years later in the workshops of master potters. But what makes it truly remarkable are the decorations that spiral around its surface, geometric patterns of such mathematical precision that they suggest their creators understood principles of symmetry and proportion that we might associate with much later civilizations. The people who created these beautiful objects lived in settlements that were growing steadily larger and more complex with each passing generation. What had begun as simple farming villages were becoming small towns with specialized craftsmen, with traders who traveled great distances, and with religious centers where the community gathered to honor their gods and celebrate the turning of the seasons. It is here, in these growing towns of the 5th and 4th millennia before Christ, that we encounter one of the great mysteries of ancient Elam. For these people were beginning to develop something that would set them apart from their neighbors for thousands of years to come, their own unique form of writing. Scholars call it Proto-Elamite script, and even today, despite decades of careful study, much of it remains undeciphered. Imagine tablets covered with signs that are clearly not random scratches or decorative patterns, but systematic symbols that must have conveyed meaning to those who created them. Some of these signs look almost like pictures of animals or objects from daily life. Others are purely abstract, geometric forms that might represent sounds, ideas, or concepts that we can only guess at. What we do know is that this writing system was distinctly Elamite. It was not borrowed wholesale from the Sumerians to the west, though there was certainly contact between these two civilizations. It was not an early form of any Indo-European script, though the Elamites would later interact extensively with Indo-European peoples. Instead, it appears to be something entirely original, the product of minds that approached the challenge of preserving thoughts and information in their own unique way. As you lie there, listening to this ancient story, allow yourself to imagine what it might have been like to be present in one of those early towns when writing was still new and magical. Picture a scribe, perhaps a woman, for Elamite society would prove to give women roles of unusual prominence, sitting cross-legged on a woven mat in the courtyard of a temple or palace. Before her lies a tablet of soft clay, and in her hand is a reed stylus, its tip shaped for making the precise marks that will preserve important information for future generations. What thoughts might she be recording? Perhaps the details of a trade agreement with merchants from distant Sumer. perhaps a hymn to one of the Elamite gods, perhaps records of grain stored for the coming winter, or the genealogy of a royal family. We can only speculate, for the Proto-Elamite script keeps its secret still. But in the careful precision of each mark she makes, we can see the same attention to beauty and order that characterized Elamite pottery, Elamite jewelry, and all the other artifacts that have survived from this distant time. This period, which archaeologists call the Proto-Elamite period, was a time of remarkable cultural flowering. Trade networks that stretched from the Persian Gulf to Central Asia brought new ideas, new technologies, and new artistic influences to the Elamite heartland. Yet rather than simply copying what they encountered, the Elamite people showed an extraordinary ability to synthesize outside influences with their own traditions, creating something that was recognizably their own. Religious life during this early period was already taking on the characteristics that would define Elamite spirituality for millennia. The people were building temples, modest structures at first, but temples nonetheless, dedicated to deities whose names and stories were uniquely Elamite. Chief among these was Inshushinak, who would eventually become the great protective god of the city of Susa. Even in these earliest times, there are hints in the archaeological record of the special reverence paid to this deity, whose name means something like Lord of Susa, and who was believed to watch over the growing community with paternal care. The worship of Inshushinak and the other early Elamite deities was not the distant, formal religion of some ancient civilizations, but something more intimate and personal. Sacred springs bubbled up from the earth in groves that became natural temples. Certain trees, certain stones, certain hills were recognized as dwelling places of divine spirits. The boundary between the everyday world and the sacred world was fluid, permeable, touched with a gentle mysticism that would remain characteristic of Elamite culture throughout its long history. As this early period progressed, we begin to see evidence of increasing social complexity. The simple farming villages were giving way to more sophisticated settlements, with clear distinctions between ordinary houses and larger, more elaborate structures that must have belonged to chiefs, priests, or wealthy merchants. Yet this growing inequality does not seem to have been harsh or exploitative in the way it sometimes was in other ancient civilizations. The archaeological record suggests a society that was hierarchical but also caring, one where the powerful had responsibilities as well as privileges. During these centuries of slow development, the people of Elam were also learning to work with metals in increasingly sophisticated ways. Bronze, that revolutionary alloy of copper and tin that would give its name to an entire age of human history, was being crafted into tools and weapons of exceptional quality. But more than that, Elamite metalworkers were creating objects of pure beauty, mirrors polished to perfection, jewelry that would not look out of place in a modern museum, and vessels decorated with scenes of animals and humans that seemed to capture the very essence of life in motion. Let your mind linger for a moment on one such creation as you rest there in the gathering peace of night. Picture a bronze mirror, its surface gleaming like still water under the ancient sun. Around its edge runs a decoration of incredible delicacy. Gazelles leaping through stylized vegetation, their forms so graceful and naturalistic that you can almost see them moving. This is not the work of a crude metalsmith learning his trade, but of an artist who understood both the technical demands of working bronze and the aesthetic principles that make something truly beautiful. Such objects tell us that even in these early centuries, Elamite society had reached a level of prosperity and stability that allowed time and resources for the creation of beauty. This was not a people struggling merely to survive, but one that had achieved enough security to pursue the higher aspects of human culture: art, writing, complex religious thought, and the sophisticated social organization that makes such achievements possible. As the fourth millennium before Christ drew to a close, the various elements that would define Elamite civilization were falling into place like pieces of an intricate puzzle. The Proto-Elamite script was becoming more standardized, suggesting increasing contact between different communities and perhaps the emergence of a shared cultural identity that transcended local loyalties. Religious practices were becoming more formalized, with evidence of regular festivals and ceremonies that brought people together from considerable distances. Most importantly, the Elamites were beginning to interact more systematically with their neighbors, particularly with the Sumerian city-states to the west. These interactions would prove to be crucial in shaping Elam's future, bringing both opportunities for cultural enrichment and challenges that would test the young civilization's adaptability and strength. As you settle even more deeply into rest now, feeling the story of ancient Elam weaving itself into your consciousness like a gentle current carrying you toward peaceful sleep, know that we have witnessed the birth of something truly remarkable. From simple farming villages scattered across a beautiful landscape, a unique civilization was emerging, one that would soon take its place among the great powers of the ancient world, while never losing its essential character, its gift for synthesis, its appreciation for beauty, and its distinctive approach to the eternal human questions of how to live well and how to understand our place in the vast mystery of existence. The sun rises now over ancient Susa, and with it comes the dawn of a new age in our gentle journey through Elamite history. As you rest there in comfort, allow yourself to drift forward through the mists of time to around 3,200 years before Christ, when the scattered communities we have been observing begin to coalesce into something grander and more enduring: the first true Elamite kingdoms. Picture yourself standing on a small hill overlooking the site where Susa will grow into one of the ancient world's great cities. In the soft light of early morning, you can see that what was once a collection of separate villages has now become a substantial settlement, its mud brick buildings spreading across the fertile plain like a constellation of human ambition and ingenuity. Smoke rises from countless hearths, creating a gentle haze that softens the outline of the Zagros Mountains in the distance. This is the period that archaeologists call Susa the Furwakers, and it marks the true beginning of Elamite urban civilization. The people living here are no longer simply farmers and herders organized into family groups and village councils. They have begun to develop the complex political and social structures that define a true state: specialized craftsmen, professional soldiers, a priestly class, and above all, rulers whose authority extends far beyond their own blood relatives. The transformation was not sudden or violent, as it sometimes was in other parts of the ancient world. Instead, it seems to have grown organically from the Elamite genius for synthesis and adaptation that we have already observed. As trade networks expanded and brought increasing wealth to the region, as populations grew and required more sophisticated organization, as contact with Mesopotamian city-states introduced new ideas about governance and urban planning, The Elamites responded by creating political structures that were unmistakably their own while borrowing the best ideas from their neighbors. In your mind's eye, walk with me now through the streets of early Susa. The roads are wider than those in the old village settlements, paved with stone and designed to accommodate not just foot traffic, but also the ox-drawn carts that carry goods to and from the markets. The houses, while still built of mud brick, show greater variety in size and decoration, reflecting the growing wealth and social stratification of Elamite society. At the heart of the city stands the most impressive structure of all, a complex of buildings that serves as both palace and temple, the earthly residence of the ruler and the dwelling place of the gods. This is not yet the grand ziggurat that would later make Susa famous throughout the ancient world, but it is substantial enough to dominate the skyline and impressive enough to communicate the growing power and ambition of Elamite civilization. The rulers of this early period are shadowy figures to us, their names lost to the silence of millennia or preserved only in fragmentary inscriptions whose meanings scholars still debate. But we can sense their presence in the archaeological record, in the carefully planned expansion of the city, in the sophisticated hydraulic systems that brought fresh water from mountain springs, in the workshops where master craftsmen created objects of increasing beauty and complexity under royal patronage. These early Elamite kings and queens, for women often held positions of remarkable authority in Elamite society, faced challenges that would test their diplomatic skills as much as their administrative abilities. To the west, the great Sumerian cities of Uruk, and Babylon were entering their own period of expansion and consolidation. These were sophisticated civilizations with powerful armies, advanced technologies, and imperial ambitions that sometimes extended to Elamite territory. Yet, rather than simply resisting or surrendering to Mesopotamian influence, the Elamites developed a characteristically nuanced response. They became willing students of Sumerian culture, adopting cuneiform writing for official documents and diplomatic correspondence, incorporating Mesopotamian artistic motifs into their own decorative traditions, and even worshiping some Sumerian gods alongside their own ancient deities. But this cultural borrowing was selective and strategic, never wholesale or subservient. The Elamites learned to read and write cuneiform, but they used it to record texts in their own Elamite language. They adopted Mesopotamian artistic techniques, but employed them to create distinctly Elamite works of art. They honored foreign gods, but always within a religious framework that remained fundamentally their own. This period of cultural exchange was also one of increasing prosperity. Susa's location at the intersection of major trade routes made it a natural hub for commerce between the Iranian plateau and the Mesopotamian plains. Caravans carrying lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, precious metals from the Zagros Mountains, and exotic goods from India and Central Asia all passed through Elamite territory, enriching the kingdom's treasury and exposing its people to ideas and influences from across the known world. Allow yourself to imagine the marketplace of ancient Susa during this golden age of early trade. The air is filled with the sound of different languages as merchants from distant lands negotiate over goods whose very names speak of far horizons: frankincense from the Arabian Peninsula, ivory from Africa, silk from the mysterious lands far to the east. Elamite traders, fluent in multiple languages and skilled in the complex art of international commerce, move among these foreign visitors like gracious hosts, welcoming guests from every corner of the earth. Yet for all their cosmopolitan outlook, the people of Susa never forgot their roots in the soil of their homeland. The great festivals that marked the changing seasons were still celebrated with ancient rituals that connected the urban dwellers to the agricultural cycles that sustained them. The worship of Inshushinak, the protective god of Susa, became more elaborate and formal, but never lost its essential character as a relationship between a community and its divine guardian. As the third millennium before Christ progressed, we enter the period known as Susa II, when Elamite civilization reached new heights of sophistication and began to exert its own influence on the broader region. The city had grown large enough to require complex administrative systems, and the surviving tablets from this period show us scribes recording everything from tax collections to temple offerings with meticulous care. The art of this period reveals a culture that had achieved a remarkable synthesis of influences while maintaining its distinctive character. Bronze work reached levels of technical excellence that would not be surpassed for many centuries. Jewelry of extraordinary delicacy adorned the bodies of Elamite nobles. Seals carved with intricate scenes of religious and mythological significance were used to mark official documents and personal possessions. One such seal, which you might imagine holding in your hand as you rest there in the gathering peace of night, bears an image that captures something essential about Elamite culture. It shows a figure, perhaps a priest or ruler, standing before a sacred tree while various animals move in procession around the edges of the composition. The carving is exquisite, each detail rendered with loving precision, but what makes it truly remarkable is the sense of harmony it conveys between human beings, nature, and the divine realm. This harmony was not merely artistic, but reflected a real aspect of Elamite society. Unlike some ancient civilizations that saw themselves as separate from or opposed to the natural world, the Elamites maintained a deep connection to their landscape. Their cities were built in partnership with the environment rather than in defiance of it. Their religious practices honored the sacred character of natural sites. Their art consistently portrayed humans and animals as part of a unified creation rather than as antagonists in an eternal struggle. During this prosperous period, the Elamites also began to develop the military capabilities that would soon make them formidable opponents of their more aggressive neighbors. The rugged terrain of their homeland provided natural training grounds for hardy soldiers, while their wealth allowed them to equip armies with high-quality bronze weapons and protective gear. Most importantly, their strategic position gave them intimate knowledge of the mountain passes and river crossings that any invading army would need to control. Yet the Elamites' preferred approach to international relations remained diplomatic rather than military. When conflicts arose with Mesopotamian city-states, they often sought negotiated solutions that acknowledged the legitimate interests of all parties. When marriages were arranged between Elamite and foreign royal families, they were genuine partnerships that strengthened both kingdoms rather than mere diplomatic conveniences. This preference for negotiation over confrontation would be tested severely as the third millennium drew to a close. To the west, the great Akkadian Empire was rising under rulers like Sargon the Great, whose ambitions extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of Mesopotamian influence. These were conquerors who believed in the virtue of expansion, who saw negotiation as weakness, and who would not hesitate to use overwhelming force to achieve their goals. The stage was being set for conflicts that would test every aspect of Elamite civilization: their military prowess, their diplomatic skill, their cultural resilience, and their ability to maintain their distinctive identity in the face of external pressure. But as you drift deeper into rest now, following the gentle current of this ancient story toward peaceful sleep, know that the Elamites had spent centuries preparing for these challenges, building not just cities and armies, but the cultural foundations that would allow them to endure and ultimately to triumph over adversity. In the markets of Susa, in the workshops of master craftsmen, in the temples where priests maintained the ancient rituals that connected earth to heaven, the Elamite people had created something precious and enduring. They had built a civilization that honored both tradition and innovation, that welcomed foreign influence while maintaining its own integrity, that valued beauty and harmony as much as power and wealth. The sun sets now over ancient Susa, painting the mud brick walls in shades of gold and crimson that echo the colors of the mountain sunset. In the gathering dusk, oil lamps begin to flicker in windows across the city, creating a gentle constellation of human warmth and fellowship that mirrors the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above. This is Elam at the end of its early kingdoms period, prosperous and confident, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. As the wheel of centuries turns and carries us deeper into the story of ancient Elam, we find ourselves witnessing one of history's most fascinating and complex relationships between civilizations. Allow your mind to drift now across the span of nearly 1,000 years, from around 2100 to 1100 before the birth of Christ, when the mature kingdom of Elam would engage in an intricate dance of diplomacy, warfare, alliance, and rivalry with the greatest power of ancient Mesopotamia, Babylon. Picture yourself floating high above the ancient landscape as dawn breaks over two great cities, separated by only a few hundred miles, but representing vastly different approaches to civilization and power. To the west, Babylon rises from the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, its famous ziggurat reaching toward heaven like a man-made mountain, its broad avenues bustling with merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims from across the known world. To the east, Susa nestles in its valley beneath the Zagros Mountains, smaller perhaps, but no less magnificent, its own temples and palaces speaking of a culture that has learned to blend strength with subtlety, ambition with wisdom. These two cities and the civilizations they represented were destined to be locked in a relationship that defied simple categorization. They were sometimes bitter enemies, their armies clashing on dusty battlefields, while their peoples suffered the devastation of war. They were sometimes close allies, their royal families intermarrying, their merchants trading freely across the borderlands, their scholars sharing knowledge and wisdom. Most often, they maintained a wary respect for each other, like two powerful neighbors who understand that their fates are intertwined, whether they wish it or not. The story of this relationship begins in earnest with the rise of the Akkadian Empire and continues through the various dynasties that would rule from Babylon, the Amorites, the Kassites, and others whose names echo through the corridors of ancient history. But it is during the time of Hammurabi and his successors that we see the full complexity of Elamite-Babylonian relations begin to unfold. Hammurabi, whose law code would become one of the most famous documents of the ancient world, understood that any Mesopotamian empire worthy of the name would need to either conquer or accommodate the kingdom of Elam. The Elamites controlled the crucial mountain passes that connected Mesopotamia to the Iranian plateau and beyond. They commanded the trade routes that brought precious stones, metals, and exotic goods from the far reaches of Asia. Most importantly, they possessed a military tradition that had been honed by centuries of defending their mountain homeland against various invaders. Yet, when Hammurabi chose to test Elamite resolve, he discovered what many other Mesopotamian rulers would learn over the coming centuries. The Elamites were not easily conquered or intimidated. In battles whose details have been lost to time, but whose outcomes were recorded in the careful chronicles of both civilizations, Elamite forces proved capable of standing toe-to-toe with the finest armies of Babylon. The Elamite military success rested on several factors that you might contemplate as you settle more deeply into rest. First was their intimate knowledge of terrain that favored defenders over attackers. The approaches to Susa and the other great Elamite cities wound through mountain valleys where small forces could hold off much larger armies, where local knowledge of hidden paths and water sources could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Second was their mastery of archery, a skill that had been perfected over generations of hunting in the forests and high meadows of the Zagros Mountains. Elamite bowmen could send arrows with deadly accuracy across distances that left enemy soldiers helpless to retaliate. Their composite bows, crafted from horn, sinew, and specially selected woods, were marvels of engineering that gave them range and power that few other armies could match. But perhaps most importantly, the Elamites possessed something that could not be bought or borrowed from their neighbors: a deep sense of fighting for their homeland, their gods, and their way of life. When Babylonian armies invaded Elamite territory, they were not merely conquering another province for their empire. They were threatening the very existence of a unique civilization that had taken centuries to develop. This fierce defensive spirit was most dramatically displayed during the invasions of the Assyrian period, when the great king Sennacherib attempted to add Elam to his vast empire. The Elamites responded with a strategy that combined military prowess with diplomatic cunning. While their armies harassed Assyrian forces in the mountains, their diplomats worked to forge alliances with Babylon and other Mesopotamian powers, who saw Assyrian expansion as a threat to their own independence. The result was one of the ancient world's great upsets. The Elamites not only successfully defended their homeland, but actually launched counterattacks that penetrated deep into Mesopotamian territory. In the most dramatic episode of all, Elamite forces marched on Babylon itself and, in a move that shocked the entire ancient world, captured the sacred statue of Marduk, the patron god of the Babylonian people. Imagine, if you can, the profound symbolic significance of this act as you rest there in the gathering peace of night. In the religious worldview of ancient Mesopotamia, the statue of a city's patron god was not merely a work of art or a focus for worship. It was the actual dwelling place of the divine presence on earth. To lose such a statue to foreign conquerors was not just a military defeat, but a spiritual catastrophe that called into question the very foundations of a civilization's relationship with the gods. For over a century, the statue of Marduk remained in Elamite hands, housed presumably in one of the great temples of Susa, where it was treated with the respect due to a powerful deity, but also kept as a tangible symbol of Elamite victory over their Western neighbors. The psychological impact on Babylon was enormous. How could they claim to be the center of the world when their own god was held captive in a foreign land? Yet, even in this moment of triumph, the Elamites displayed the diplomatic sophistication that characterized their approach to international relations. They did not use their possession of Marduk's statue to humiliate or destroy Babylonian civilization. Instead, they treated it as a bargaining chip in the complex game of ancient Near Eastern politics, a valuable asset that could be returned when the time was right and the conditions were favorable. The eventual return of the statue, accomplished through a combination of diplomatic negotiation and strategic calculation, marked the beginning of a new phase in Elamite-Babylonian relations. Both sides had learned valuable lessons about each other's capabilities and intentions. The Babylonians had discovered that the Elamites were not merely troublesome mountain dwellers, but a sophisticated civilization capable of projecting power across great distances. The Elamites had demonstrated that they could more than hold their own against the greatest powers of their time. What followed was a period of cautious cooperation that benefited both civilizations. Trade relationships that had been disrupted by warfare were reestablished and expanded. Cultural exchange resumed, with Elamite and Babylonian artists, craftsmen, and scholars learning from each other in ways that enriched both traditions. Royal marriages were arranged between the two kingdoms, creating family ties that made future conflicts less likely and more easily resolved. During this period of cooperation, you might envision caravans moving peacefully between Susa and Babylon, their loads protected by treaties that guaranteed safe passage and fair treatment for merchants from both kingdoms. In the workshops of both cities, craftsmen were creating objects that blended Elamite and Babylonian artistic traditions in ways that produced results more beautiful than either could have achieved alone. The courts of both kingdoms became cosmopolitan centers where diplomats, merchants, and scholars from across the ancient world gathered to share news, negotiate agreements, and participate in the intellectual life of the age. An Elamite prince might receive his education in Babylon, learning to read and write in multiple languages and studying the legal and administrative techniques that made Mesopotamian civilization so successful. A Babylonian princess might marry into the Elamite royal family, bringing with her not only a diplomatic alliance, but also knowledge of architecture, agriculture, and other practical arts. Yet, even during these peaceful interludes, both sides remained acutely aware that their fundamental interests were not always aligned. Babylon's natural tendency toward expansion and imperial dominance conflicted with Elam's determination to maintain its independence and territorial integrity. Trade disputes could escalate into diplomatic crises. Succession struggles in one kingdom could destabilize relationships with the other. The challenge for rulers on both sides was to manage this inherent tension without allowing it to explode into the kind of destructive warfare that would damage both civilizations. This required diplomatic skills of the highest order, the ability to make credible threats without actually carrying them out, to negotiate advantageous agreements without humiliating the other party, to maintain military preparedness without appearing to be preparing for war. Both civilizations developed elaborate diplomatic protocols that allowed them to communicate their intentions and concerns without triggering automatic military responses. Ambassadors traveled regularly between the courts, carrying not just official messages, but also informal communications that helped to diffuse tensions before they could escalate into crises. Gift-giving became an art form that conveyed subtle messages about friendship, respect, and relative power. As you drift deeper into rest now, following this ancient story toward peaceful sleep, picture one such diplomatic exchange taking place in the throne room of Susa. The Babylonian ambassador, dressed in robes of finest silk and accompanied by a retinue of guards, interpreters, and gift bearers, approaches the throne of the Elamite king. The gifts he presents are carefully chosen to demonstrate both Babylon's wealth and its respect for Elamite taste. Gold vessels decorated with scenes from Mesopotamian mythology, precious stones from distant lands, and scrolls containing copies of important literary works. The Elamite king receives these gifts with the gracious dignity that befits his status. But both he and the ambassador understand that the real business of their meeting lies not in the exchange of presents, but in the careful negotiation of agreements that will govern trade, territorial boundaries, and mutual defense arrangements for years to come. The discussions that follow may last for days or even weeks. Conducted with the elaborate courtesy that ancient diplomacy required, but also with the hard-headed realism that both sides understand is necessary for any lasting agreement. Each clause of each treaty must be carefully crafted to serve the interests of both parties while avoiding language that either could interpret as an insult or a threat. When agreement is finally reached, it will be recorded not only in the official languages of both kingdoms, but also sealed with religious oaths that invoke the gods of both civilizations as witnesses and guarantors. Such treaties were not merely political documents, but sacred compacts that bound both parties, not just legally, but spiritually. This delicate balance between rivalry and cooperation, between conflict and alliance, would characterize Elamite-Babylonian relations for many centuries. Like dancers in an elaborate choreography, the two civilizations moved around each other with a combination of grace and wariness, each step carefully calculated to maintain the intricate balance that allowed both to flourish while neither dominated the other completely. As dawn breaks once again over ancient Susa, let us step away from the grand theater of international politics and warfare to explore something equally fascinating but more intimate: the daily life of the Elamite people themselves. Allow your mind to drift gently through the streets and homes, workshops and gardens of this remarkable civilization, discovering how ordinary men and women lived, worked, loved, and found meaning in their world thousands of years ago. Picture yourself walking through the residential quarter of Susa on a pleasant morning in spring, when the air carries the scent of almond blossoms from the surrounding orchards and the sound of children playing in courtyards shaded by date palms. The houses around you are built of sun-dried brick, their flat roofs designed to catch and channel the precious rainwater that falls during the brief wet season. Their walls thick enough to provide cool refuge from the summer heat that will come in a few months' time. These are not the grand palaces of kings or the imposing temples of gods, but the homes of merchants, craftsmen, farmers, and the countless others who formed the backbone of Elamite society. Yet even these modest dwellings show evidence of the aesthetic sensibility that characterized Elamite culture at every level. The doorways are framed with carefully placed stones that create pleasing geometric patterns. The interior walls are painted with simple but elegant designs that echo the natural forms found in the surrounding landscape. Flowing water, growing plants, the graceful curves of mountain ridges against the sky. Step with me now through one such doorway into the home of a prosperous Elamite family. The entrance opens onto a central courtyard where much of the family's daily life unfolds. Here, beneath the open sky but sheltered from the dust and noise of the street, children play games that have been passed down through countless generations, while their mothers weave cloth on looms whose basic design has remained unchanged since the dawn of civilization. The weaving itself tells a story that speaks to the heart of Elamite culture. The patterns worked into the fabric are not random decorations, but symbolic representations of the family's history, their religious beliefs, and their connection to the natural world. A border of stylized mountain peaks might represent the family's ancestral home in the highlands. Geometric patterns in earth tones might symbolize the agricultural cycles that govern rural life. Delicate depictions of flowers and animals might serve as prayers for fertility and abundance in the coming year. The woman working at the loom is not merely producing a utilitarian object, but engaging in an act of cultural transmission, embedding the wisdom and values of her people into something that will outlast her own lifetime. Her daughter, watching from nearby while playing with a doll whose clothes reflect the same patterns, is unconsciously absorbing lessons about beauty, tradition, and identity that will shape her own understanding of what it means to be Elamite. In another corner of the courtyard, the man of the house is engaged in his own craft. He is a metalworker, one of the skilled artisans who made Elamite bronze work famous throughout the ancient world. Before him, on a low table, lie the tools of his trade: hammers of different weights and sizes, chisels with edges sharpened to hair-thin precision, and small anvils shaped to create the subtle curves that distinguish Elamite metalwork from the products of other civilizations. The object taking shape under his patient hands is a mirror, its polished bronze surface destined to reflect the face of some wealthy patron, while its decorated back tells stories from Elamite mythology. Watch as he works, each tap of his hammer carefully controlled, each line etched with the confidence that comes from years of practice and generations of inherited knowledge. The scene he is creating shows a procession of animals moving through a stylized landscape. But these are not ordinary animals. They are the sacred creatures of Elamite religion: the lion that represents royal power, the bull that symbolizes fertility, the eagle that connects earth to sky. As you observe this master craftsman at work, let yourself appreciate the extraordinary skill required to create such objects without the benefit of modern tools or techniques. Every curve must be shaped by hand and eye alone. Every line must be incised with tools that the artisan has made himself. Every decorative element must be perfectly balanced, not only aesthetically, but also technically, for a single mistake could ruin hours or even days of careful work. Yet, the finished products of Elamite craftsmen were renowned throughout the ancient world for their technical excellence and artistic beauty. Archaeological excavations have uncovered bronze vessels, jewelry, and weapons that rival the finest work produced anywhere in the ancient world. These objects found their way into the treasuries of foreign kings, the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs, and the temples of Mesopotamian gods, carried by trade networks that stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the borders of India. The success of Elamite artisans was built not only on individual skill, but on sophisticated systems of apprenticeship and guild organization that ensured the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. A young person who showed aptitude for metalwork might be taken into a master's workshop as early as age 10 or 12, beginning with simple tasks like maintaining the fires and organizing tools before gradually being allowed to participate in more complex aspects of the craft. This apprenticeship system created strong bonds of loyalty and mutual obligation that extended far beyond the workshop itself. Master craftsmen were expected to provide not just technical training, but moral guidance, helping their apprentices develop the character traits that Elamite society valued: patience, attention to detail, respect for tradition, and the ability to find beauty in humble materials and everyday tasks. The same values that guided craft production also shaped other aspects of Elamite life. In the schools where children learned to read and write, education was viewed not merely as the acquisition of practical skills, but as a process of moral and spiritual development. Students learned not only the cuneiform script that was used for official documents, but also the ancient Elamite writing system that connected them to their cultural roots. Literature played an important role in this educational process. Elamite scribes created and preserved stories, poems, and religious texts that taught lessons about proper behavior, the relationship between humans and gods, and the responsibilities that came with membership in civilized society. These works often featured characters who faced moral dilemmas similar to those that ordinary people encountered in their daily lives, providing models for ethical decision-making that were both practical and inspiring. The role of women in Elamite society deserves special attention as you rest there in the gathering peace of night, for it reveals another way in which Elamite civilization differed from many of its ancient neighbors. While women in most ancient societies were largely confined to domestic roles, Elamite women enjoyed a degree of freedom and authority that would have been remarkable in Babylon, Egypt, or Assyria. Elamite queens were not merely ceremonial figures, but active participants in government who could inherit and exercise royal power in their own right. The title Queen Mother carried particular prestige and authority, recognizing the special role that older women played as keepers of tradition and advisors to rulers. Even ordinary women could own property, engage in business transactions, and participate in religious ceremonies in ways that gave them significant influence within their communities. This relatively elevated status of women may have reflected the important role that goddesses played in Elamite religion. Unlike the predominantly male pantheons of some neighboring civilizations, the Elamite religious system included powerful female deities who were seen as equal partners with their male counterparts in governing the cosmos. Kiririsha, the great mother goddess, was believed to control fertility and agricultural abundance. Nurundi was associated with victory in war and the protection of cities. These divine models may have provided religious justification for the expanded roles that mortal women played in Elamite society. Religious life permeated every aspect of daily existence in ways that modern people might find difficult to imagine. The day began with prayers and offerings at the household shrine, where small statues of the family's protective deities received daily attention in the form of food, drink, and burning incense. Before undertaking any important task, whether it was beginning the harvest, opening a new business, or arranging a marriage, Elamite families consulted religious specialists who could determine the most auspicious timing and the proper rituals to ensure divine blessing. Yet, Elamite religion was not a grim or fearful affair, but something that brought joy and community celebration into people's lives. The great festivals that marked the changing seasons were occasions for feasting, music, dancing, and the temporary suspension of normal social hierarchies. During these celebrations, ordinary citizens could approach their rulers with petitions and complaints. Craftsmen could display their finest work in public competitions, and young people could meet potential marriage partners under the watchful but benevolent eyes of their elders. The cuisine that graced Elamite tables during these festivals reflected the agricultural abundance of their homeland and the cosmopolitan influences of their trade connections. Barley and wheat provided the foundation for various types of bread and beer. Date palms yielded sweet fruit that could be eaten fresh or dried for preservation. Pomegranates, figs, and grapes added variety and flavor to meals that might also include lamb or goat meat, fresh fish from the rivers, and dairy products from the herds that grazed in mountain pastures. Spices and seasonings arrived from distant lands along the trade routes that made Susa wealthy. Cinnamon from India, black pepper from Southeast Asia, and various aromatics from the Arabian Peninsula. These exotic ingredients were not merely luxury items for the wealthy, but found their way into the cooking of ordinary families, creating a distinctive Elamite cuisine that combined local traditions with international influences. As evening falls over ancient Susa and oil lamps begin to flicker in windows throughout the city, families gather for the evening meal that serves as both physical nourishment and spiritual communion. Grandparents share stories that preserve the memory of earlier generations. Parents offer guidance and instruction to their children. Young adults discuss their hopes and plans for the future. In these intimate moments, the great themes of Elamite civilization, respect for tradition, openness to change, aesthetic refinement, and spiritual awareness, are transmitted from one generation to the next through the simple but profound medium of family conversation. The houses grow quiet as night deepens and the ancient city settles into rest. But even in sleep, the people of Elam remain connected to the cultural patterns that give meaning to their lives. Their dreams are shaped by the stories they have heard, the artworks they have seen, the rituals they have participated in throughout their days. And in the morning, they will wake to continue the patient work of creating and preserving a civilization that honors both human achievement and divine mystery. As the gentle evening breeze carries us deeper into the heart of ancient Elam, we find ourselves drawn to the sacred spaces where the Elamites commune with forces greater than themselves. Here, in the shadowed courtyards of temple complexes, and beneath the star-scattered dome of the Persian sky, we encounter a world where the divine touches the earthly realm with fingers of light and mystery. The people of Elam, those patient cultivators of the fertile plains between mountain and river, possessed a deep and abiding relationship with their gods. Theirs was not a faith born of fear, but rather one that grew like the date palms along their irrigation channels, slowly, steadily, with roots that reached deep into the soil of tradition and branches that stretched toward the infinite heavens above. Let us walk together through their sacred groves of belief, where the whispers of ancient prayers still echo in the evening air, and where the names of forgotten deities drift like incense through the corridors of time. At the very heart of the Elamite pantheon stood three magnificent beings, forming what scholars have come to recognize as the divine triad that watched over this ancient land. Like three pillars supporting the roof of heaven, these deities held the cosmic order in delicate balance, each fulfilling their sacred role in the great symphony of existence. First among these was Inshushinak, whose name itself carries the weight of ages. To the people of Susa, that jewel of a city nestled in the embrace of the Zagros foothills, he was far more than a distant deity dwelling in unreachable heavens. Inshushinak was their protector, their guardian, their divine shepherd who watched over both the living and the dead with equal tenderness. Picture, if you will, the morning mists rising from the rivers that flowed past Susa's walls. As the first rays of sunlight pierce through that ethereal veil, illuminating the stepped walls of the great ziggurat, one can almost sense the presence of Inshushinak stirring to wakefulness. For he was the Lord of oaths, the keeper of promises, the divine judge who ensured that justice flowed through the land like water through carefully tended channels. The Elamites believed that when a person's earthly journey came to its natural end, it was Inshushinak who would greet them at the threshold of the underworld, not as a harsh judge wielding punishment, but as a compassionate guide who understood the weight of mortal struggles. His was the final word on the worth of a soul, spoken not in thunder, but in the quiet wisdom of one who had observed countless human stories unfold beneath the changing seasons. In the temple inscriptions carved into stone with the patience of devoted hands, Inshushinak was often called Father of the Weak. This title speaks to something profound about the Elamite understanding of divine power. True strength, they seemed to believe, lay not in domination but in protection of those who could not protect themselves. The god's symbol was the serpent, not the venomous creature of destruction, but the wise snake that sheds its skin to be reborn, representing the eternal cycle of death and renewal that governs all existence. Standing beside Inshushinak in the celestial hierarchy was Kiririsha, the great mother goddess whose nurturing presence breathed life into the fertile valleys of southern Elam. If Inshushinak was the protector and judge, then Kiririsha was the source, the wellspring from which all blessings flowed. She was called Mother of Gods in the ancient texts, and one can sense in this title the reverence the Elamites felt for the feminine principle that brought forth life from the dark earth. Kiririsha's domain extended over all the growing things of the world, the barley that swayed golden in the harvest winds, the date palms that offered their sweet fruit to sustain both body and spirit, the children who played in the courtyards while their mothers ground grain and sang the old songs. She was the goddess of the earth's abundance, but also of its patience. For like the soil that waits through winter's sleep to burst forth with spring's green promise, Kiririsha taught her people the sacred art of endurance. In the seasonal festivals that mark the agricultural year, when communities gathered to celebrate the planting or the harvest, Kiririsha's presence could be felt in the shared laughter, the communal meals, the stories passed from grandmother to grandchild like precious seeds being planted for future flowering. She represented the continuity of life, the unbroken chain of generations that stretches from the first human footsteps in the Garden of Elam to the distant future when new stories will be told beneath different stars. Completing this divine triad was Naparisha, the mysterious Lord of Waters, whose domain encompassed not only the life-giving rivers that flowed from the Zagros Mountains, but also the deeper currents of cosmic force that move unseen through all creation. In the Elamite understanding, water was far more than a physical element necessary for survival. Water was the medium through which divine power flowed, the carrier of blessing and curse, the mirror in which the face of eternity could sometimes be glimpsed. Napirisha governed the floods that brought both fertility and destruction, teaching the Elamites that divine power is neither wholly benevolent nor malevolent, but rather follows laws too vast for human comprehension. The priests who served in his temples learned to read the subtle signs in flowing water, the way light danced on its surface, the sounds it made as it moved over stone, the dreams that came to those who slept beside running streams. Yet the Elamite pantheon was far richer than this central triad alone. Like a garden where many different flowers bloom in harmony, their spiritual landscape was populated by dozens of deities, each with their own special gifts and areas of concern. There were gods of the hunt who blessed the arrows of those who ventured into the mountain forests, goddesses of healing who whispered remedies to those who knew how to listen, spirits of the hearth who watched over the sacred flame that burned in every home. Among these lesser deities, none was more beloved than Pinikir, a goddess often associated with love and beauty, but whose influence extended far beyond simple romance. Pinikir was the patroness of all relationships that bind communities together. The friendship between neighbors, the loyalty between ruler and subject, the bonds that hold families secure through times of both joy and sorrow. In her honor, the Elamites crafted some of their most exquisite artworks, delicate bronze figurines and intricate jewelry that seemed to capture something of her grace in metal and stone. The worship of these deities was woven seamlessly into the fabric of daily life. Unlike some ancient religions that separated the sacred from the mundane, Elamite spirituality found the divine presence in ordinary moments. The baker who shaped loaves in the pre-dawn darkness whispered a prayer to ensure the bread would nourish both body and spirit. The potter who turned clay on the wheel invoked the blessing of the earth gods to make vessels that would serve their owners well. The mother who nursed her infant beneath the evening stars sang lullabies that were also hymns of gratitude to Kiririsha for the gift of new life. The great festivals that punctuated the Elamite year were magnificent expressions of this integrated spirituality. When the time came to celebrate the annual renewal of divine power, entire cities would transform into theaters of sacred celebration. Processions would wind through the streets, carrying elaborately decorated statues of the gods, while musicians played instruments whose melodies seemed to bridge the gap between earth and heaven. The New Year festival, held when the spring floods began to recede and leave behind their gift of fertile silt, was particularly magnificent. For days, the boundaries between the human and divine worlds would blur as priests enacted ancient myths, telling again the stories of creation and renewal that gave meaning to the cycle of seasons. Common people would participate alongside the religious authorities, for the Elamites understood that the gods belonged not to an elite class, but to the entire community of believers. During these celebrations, offerings would be made, not the grim sacrifices of fear, but joyful gifts of gratitude. Fruits and flowers, carefully woven textiles, vessels filled with the finest oils and wines, all would be presented at the temple altars with songs of thanksgiving. The gods, in the Elamite understanding, desired not the destruction of earthly beauty, but its consecration, its transformation into a bridge between the mortal and immortal realms. The temples themselves were marvels of both architecture and spiritual engineering. Unlike the austere religious buildings of some cultures, Elamite sacred spaces were designed to evoke a sense of wonder and peace. Gardens surrounded the main structures, where priests cultivated not only the plants used in religious ceremonies, but also rare flowers, whose only purpose was to delight the eye and lift the spirit. Pools reflected the changing colors of sky and season, creating spaces where worshippers could sit in quiet contemplation. Inside the temples, skilled craftsmen created environments that seemed to shimmer with otherworldly beauty. Walls were decorated with intricate mosaics depicting scenes from mythological stories. Their tiny pieces of colored stone arranged with such skill that they seemed to move in the flickering light of oil lamps. Statues of the gods, carved from precious materials and adorned with gold and jewels, were positioned not as distant, untouchable icons, but as benevolent presences accessible to any sincere seeker. The priests who served in these sacred spaces were chosen not only for their knowledge of ritual and scripture, but for their understanding of the human heart. They served as counselors and healers, as interpreters of dreams and mediators in disputes. In the Elamite view, spiritual authority came not from rigid adherence to doctrine, but from wisdom gained through compassionate engagement with the struggles and joys of ordinary life. Women played particularly important roles in Elamite religious practice, often serving as high priestesses and oracles. This reflects a deeper understanding that ran through their entire culture, the recognition that the feminine principle embodied in goddesses like Kiririsha was essential to the cosmic balance. Queens and noblewomen frequently patronized temple construction and religious festivals, but even women of modest means could find meaningful roles in the spiritual life of their communities. The Elamite understanding of death and the afterlife was neither grim nor terrifying. They believed that the soul's journey beyond this world was guided by the same divine compassion that watches over the living. Inshushinak, in his role as judge of the dead, was seen not as a harsh arbiter, but as a wise counselor who helped souls understand the true meaning of their earthly experiences. The afterlife was imagined as a place of continued growth and learning, where the spirits of the departed could find peace while remaining connected to the ongoing life of their communities. Burial practices reflected this gentle understanding of mortality. Bodies were interred with grave goods, not because the dead were expected to need material possessions in the afterlife, but because these objects served as tokens of love and remembrance. A warrior might be buried with his favorite weapons, not for future battles, but as symbols of the courage and honor he had shown in life. A woman might be interred with her jewelry and cosmetics, representing the beauty and grace she had brought to the world of the living. As the centuries passed and Elam's political fortunes waxed and waned, the religious traditions showed remarkable resilience and adaptability. When foreign influences arrived, whether through trade, conquest, or cultural exchange, the Elamites showed a genius for incorporating new ideas while maintaining the essential character of their ancestral faith. Gods from neighboring Mesopotamia might find places in Elamite temples, but they were understood and worshipped through distinctly Elamite sensibilities. This religious flexibility became particularly important during the later periods of Elamite history, when political power shifted between various regional centers and external pressures grew more intense. Through all these changes, the fundamental structure of belief remained intact. The understanding that the divine presence moves through all aspects of existence, that human dignity derives from our connection to cosmic forces greater than ourselves, and that true wisdom lies in living in harmony with the natural and spiritual orders that govern the universe. The mystical dimension of Elamite religion deserves special attention, for it reveals depths of spiritual sophistication that speak to the universal human longing for transcendent experience. Priests and devoted laypeople alike practiced forms of meditation and contemplation that allowed them to experience direct communion with the divine. These practices often involved spending long periods in natural settings, beside flowing water, in mountain caves, or under the star-filled desert sky, where the boundaries between self and cosmos became permeable. Dreams were considered particularly important channels of divine communication. The Elamites developed elaborate systems for interpreting the symbolic language of sleep visions, understanding that in dreams the gods could speak directly to human consciousness without the filters of rational thought. Temple complexes included special chambers where seekers could sleep in the sacred spaces, hoping to receive guidance or healing through dream encounters with divine beings. Music and poetry played crucial roles in religious expression, for the Elamites understood that certain combinations of rhythm, melody, and language could induce states of consciousness that brought worshippers closer to the realm of the gods. Religious festivals featured complex musical performances that lasted for hours, gradually building in intensity until participants felt themselves transported beyond ordinary awareness into direct experience of divine presence. The fragrance of incense, the play of light and shadow in temple courtyards, the taste of ceremonial foods prepared according to ancient recipes. All these sensory elements were carefully orchestrated to create worship experiences that engaged the whole person, not merely the intellect. The Elamites seem to understand intuitively that the divine speaks to us through beauty as much as through doctrine, through feeling as much as through thought. As we draw our exploration of Elamite religious life toward a close, we find ourselves standing once again in that timeless space where human longing meets divine mystery. The specific forms of Elamite worship may have faded with the passing millennia, but the spiritual insights they embodied remain as relevant today as they were 4,000 years ago. In a world that often seems fragmented and chaotic, the Elamite vision of cosmic harmony offers a gentle reminder that all existence is connected by invisible threads of meaning and purpose. In an age that frequently reduces the sacred to the merely intellectual, their integration of spiritual practice with daily life suggests ways that transcendent awareness might once again become a natural part of human experience. The gods of ancient Elam continue their eternal vigil in the realm beyond time and change, but their whispered wisdom can still be heard by those who know how to listen. In the rustle of wind through date palm fronds, in the play of sunlight on flowing water, in the quiet moments of reflection that come to us between the day's activities, we might catch echoes of the same divine presence that once blessed the temples and gardens of Susa and Anshan. And now, as the soft darkness of evening settles over our journey through this ancient landscape of faith, we prepare to continue our exploration of Elam's remarkable story. The gods have shown us their faces, shared their gifts, revealed something of the eternal mystery that lies at the heart of all existence. With this sacred knowledge warming our hearts like the glow of temple fires, we move forward into the next chapter of our long dreaming, carrying with us the blessings of Inshushinak, Kiririsha, and all the divine beings who once watched over the people of this timeless land. As our journey through the sacred landscapes of Elamite belief slowly dissolves into the soft mists of memory, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of a new and magnificent chapter in the story of this remarkable civilization. The gods have blessed us with their wisdom, and now they guide our steps toward an age when their earthly kingdom would shine with unprecedented splendor. The gentle current of time carries us forward into the Middle Elamite period, that golden age that stretched from approximately 1500 to 1100 years before the Common Era. Like the first rays of dawn breaking over the Zagros Mountains, this was an epoch when Elam emerged from the shadows of regional power to claim its place among the great empires of the ancient world. Picture, if you will, the transformation that began to unfold across this blessed land, where once there had been scattered city-states, each jealously guarding its own independence. Now arose a unified realm whose influence stretched from the Persian Gulf in the south to the highland valleys of the distant mountains. This was no conquest born of crude ambition, but rather the natural flowering of a people who had finally discovered how to channel their collective strength toward purposes both noble and enduring. The rulers of this new age abandoned the ancient title of Sukalma, that designation which had linked them to the complex web of Mesopotamian politics and protocol. Instead, they chose to call themselves King of Susa and Anshan, a title that spoke to something profound about their vision of sovereignty. They were no longer content to be regional players in the great game of Near Eastern politics. They had chosen to become the masters of their own destiny, the architects of their own imperial dream. Under this new dispensation, the city of Susa transformed itself from a prosperous trading center into the beating heart of an empire. Imagine walking through its streets during this golden age, when craftsmen from across the known world labored to create wonders that would make even the jaded ambassadors of Babylon and Assyria pause in amazement. The markets overflowed with goods that told the story of Elam's expanding influence. Spices from the highlands, pearls from the Gulf waters, textiles whose intricate patterns seemed to capture the very essence of mountain winds and river songs. The palaces that rose during this period were marvels of both engineering and artistic vision. Skilled architects, drawing upon traditions that reached back to the very dawn of civilization, created structures that seemed to bridge the gap between earth and heaven. Grand courtyards provided spaces for royal ceremonies that would have rivaled anything seen in the courts of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Gardens were laid out with mathematical precision, their carefully planned vistas creating outdoor rooms where fountains sang eternal songs and exotic flowers perfumed the evening air. Yet, it was not merely the grandeur of individual buildings that marked this age of expansion and prosperity. The entire landscape of Elam began to reflect the confidence and capabilities of its rulers. New cities were founded in strategic locations, each designed not only to serve practical functions of administration and defense, but also to demonstrate the cultural sophistication that had come to characterize Elamite civilization. The road system that connected these urban centers represented one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world. These were not mere tracks worn by the passage of merchants and soldiers, but carefully planned thoroughfares that enabled rapid communication across vast distances. Rest stations were established at regular intervals, providing not only shelter and provisions for travelers, but also serving as centers where local administrators could maintain contact with the royal court. Along these roads flowed the lifeblood of the empire, not only goods and messengers, but also ideas, artistic styles, and technological innovations that helped bind the diverse regions of Elam into a coherent cultural unity. The military power that enabled this expansion was based not on the crude application of force, but on sophisticated understanding of both strategy and logistics. Elamite armies of this period combined the traditional strengths of mountain warriors, skilled archery, intimate knowledge of difficult terrain, the fierce independence that comes from defending one's homeland, with innovations borrowed and adapted from the military traditions of their neighbors. Cavalry units, trained in the art of mounted combat, provided mobility that allowed Elamite forces to strike quickly and withdraw before enemies could organize effective responses. More importantly, perhaps, the Elamite approach to conquest was marked by a wisdom that would serve them well in the administration of their expanding territories. Unlike some ancient empires that sought to impose uniformity through force, Elam generally allowed conquered peoples to maintain their local customs and religious practices. This policy of tolerance was not born of weakness, but rather of a sophisticated understanding that lasting power comes not from suppression, but from the ability to inspire loyalty among diverse populations. The wealth that flowed into Elam during this golden age was channeled into projects that revealed the deepest aspirations of the civilization. While military campaigns certainly required substantial resources, the most impressive investments were made in works of peace, temples that housed increasingly elaborate religious ceremonies, schools where scribes preserved and transmitted the growing body of Elamite literature, workshops where artisans pushed the boundaries of what was possible in bronze, gold, and precious stone. The Middle Elam period, from 1500 to 1100 BCE, represents the zenith of Elamite culture, economy, and architecture. The archaeological record from this era tells a story of unprecedented prosperity and cultural creativity. Excavations at sites across the Elamite heartland have revealed evidence of urban planning on a scale that had never been attempted before in this region. Water management systems, including elaborate networks of underground channels that brought mountain streams to irrigate distant fields, demonstrated the engineering capabilities that made agricultural abundance possible even in areas that might otherwise have remained marginal. The artistic achievements of this period deserve special attention, for they reveal not only technical skill, but also the emergence of a distinctly Elamite aesthetic vision. Bronze work reached levels of sophistication that rivaled anything being produced in contemporary Mesopotamia or Anatolia. Sculptors working in stone created monuments whose austere beauty spoke to deeper spiritual truths about the relationship between human ambition and divine purpose. Palace walls were decorated with reliefs that told stories of royal achievements, but these were not crude celebrations of military triumph. Instead, they presented subtle narratives that emphasized the ruler's role as guardian of justice and patron of cultural refinement. The textile production of this era deserves particular mention, for it represents one of the most remarkable aspects of Elamite material culture. Weavers, working with fibers imported from distant lands as well as local materials, created fabrics whose complexity and beauty astonished visitors from across the known world. These were not merely luxury goods intended for royal consumption, but rather expressions of a culture that had come to see artistic excellence as a reflection of divine favor. Trade networks during the height of Elam extended far beyond anything the region had previously known. Elamite merchants established trading posts along routes that connected the Iranian plateau with the Indus Valley, Central Asia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. These commercial relationships were not merely economic arrangements, but also channels through which cultural influences flowed in all directions. Elamite artistic styles began to appear in distant lands, while foreign innovations were adapted and incorporated into the growing repertoire of local traditions. The intellectual life of the empire flourished alongside its material prosperity. Schools attached to major temples became centers of learning where scholars preserved not only religious texts, but also practical knowledge about astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and law. The Elamite language, which had previously been used primarily for administrative purposes, began to develop a literary tradition that included historical chronicles, religious poetry, and wisdom literature that explored fundamental questions about the nature of human existence and divine purpose. Royal patronage played a crucial role in this cultural flowering. Under the Shutrakids, Uz 1210, 1100 BCE, the Elamite Empire reached the height of its power. These rulers understood that lasting greatness comes not from conquest alone, but from the ability to create and sustain civilizational achievements that inspire admiration across generations. Royal workshops produced masterworks of craftsmanship that served not only as diplomatic gifts, but also as demonstrations of the cultural sophistication that had come to characterize Elamite society. The religious life of the empire during this golden age reflected the same confidence and creativity that marked other aspects of Elamite civilization. New temples were constructed on a scale that rivaled the great religious complexes of Babylon and Assyria. These were not merely enlarged versions of earlier structures, but rather innovative architectural statements that incorporated influences from across the known world while maintaining distinctly Elamite characteristics. Festival cycles became more elaborate and inclusive, serving not only religious functions, but also providing opportunities for different regions of the empire to celebrate their common identity while maintaining their local distinctiveness. The great annual celebrations at Susa drew participants from across Elam's territories, creating shared experiences that helped bind the diverse populations into a unified cultural community. International relations during this period were conducted with a sophistication that reflected Elam's growing confidence in its place among the great powers of the age. Diplomatic correspondence, preserved in archives that archaeologists have gradually uncovered, reveals a complex web of alliances, trade agreements, and cultural exchanges that extended from Egypt in the west to the Indus Valley in the east. Elamite ambassadors were received with honor in foreign courts, while foreign dignitaries who visited Susa carried home reports of a civilization that had achieved remarkable levels of prosperity and cultural refinement. Marriage alliances played an important role in this diplomatic activity, but these were not merely political arrangements. The Elamite practice of according significant authority to royal women meant that foreign princesses who married into the Elamite royal family often became important cultural bridges, bringing new ideas and practices that enriched the empire's intellectual and artistic life. The military campaigns of this period were conducted with strategic vision that went far beyond simple territorial expansion. Elamite armies moved with purposes that combined immediate tactical objectives with longer-term goals of creating defensible borders and securing access to resources that would sustain the empire's prosperity. The famous raids into Mesopotamia, which brought back not only treasure but also skilled craftsmen and important cultural artifacts, demonstrated the sophistication of Elamite strategic thinking. Yet, even at the height of their power, the rulers of Elam maintained the essential characteristics that had distinguished their civilization from its earliest days. The integration of mountain and plain cultures continued to provide distinctive advantages in both military and civilian contexts. The tradition of according important roles to women in political and religious life meant that the empire could draw upon the full range of human talent in addressing complex challenges. Environmental management during this golden age demonstrated remarkable foresight. The expansion of agriculture was accomplished without the ecological devastation that marked some other ancient civilizations. Crop rotation systems, carefully managed grazing patterns, and sustainable forestry practices suggest that Elamite administrators understood the need to balance immediate prosperity with long-term environmental health. Urban planning reflected similar wisdom. Cities were laid out with consideration for future growth, but also with attention to maintaining the quality of life that made Elamite urban centers attractive to both residents and visitors. Public spaces were designed to serve not only practical functions, but also to provide settings for the cultural activities that had become central to Elamite civic identity. The legal system that evolved during this period combined traditional Elamite concepts of justice with innovations adapted from the legal traditions of neighboring civilizations. The result was a body of law that was both sophisticated and flexible, capable of addressing the complex disputes that arose in an increasingly cosmopolitan society, while maintaining the essential Elamite commitment to protecting the vulnerable and maintaining social harmony. As this golden age reached its zenith, the Empire of Elam had achieved something remarkable in the context of ancient history. It had created a civilization that combined military power with cultural sophistication, territorial expansion with environmental responsibility, central authority with respect for local traditions. The cities of Elam had become centers of learning and artistic creation that attracted scholars and craftsmen from across the known world. Yet, even as we celebrate these magnificent achievements, we sense the subtle shadows that were beginning to gather on the horizon. For the very success of Elam had attracted the attention of other powers, and the world was changing in ways that would soon present new and unprecedented challenges. The great empires of Mesopotamia were entering periods of renewed vigor, while new peoples were moving across the landscape of the ancient Near East, carrying with them military technologies and political ambitions that would reshape the entire region. But for now, in this moment of golden splendor, we can rest in admiration of what the Elamites had achieved. Their empire stood as a beacon of civilizational accomplishment, a demonstration of humanity's capacity to create institutions and cultural forms that elevate the human spirit while providing security and prosperity for countless generations. The evening stars that had witnessed the empire's rise continued their eternal vigil over the palace courtyards of Susa and Anshan, their gentle light blessing the achievements of this remarkable people. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the great cities settled into peaceful slumber, the whispered prayers of grateful citizens rose like incense toward the heavens, carrying with them the hopes and dreams of a civilization that had learned to balance power with wisdom, ambition with compassion. And now, as our own journey through this golden age draws toward its close, we prepare to follow the currents of time toward the next chapter of Elam's remarkable story. The foundations have been laid, the heights have been achieved, but ahead lie trials that will test everything this great civilization has built. With hearts warmed by the memory of Elam's golden dawn, we drift gently toward the challenges and transformations that await in the unfolding tapestry of ancient history. The golden sunset that had blessed the height of Elamite power slowly gives way to gathering storm clouds on the horizon of history. As we continue our gentle journey through time, we find ourselves approaching one of the most tragic and yet profoundly human chapters in the long story of ancient Elam. For every civilization, no matter how magnificent its achievements, must eventually face the great test of its mortality. The winds of change that began to stir across the ancient Near East in the 7th century before the Common Era carried with them the scent of iron and ambition. To the northwest, in the harsh valleys of northern Mesopotamia, a power had been growing that would reshape the entire landscape of the ancient world. The Assyrian Empire, with its capital at Nineveh, had become a military machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Imagine, if you will, the court of Susa during these fateful years, when messengers arrived with increasingly troubling reports from the western borders. The great kings who had presided over Elam's golden age were giving way to rulers who found themselves confronting challenges that their ancestors had never faced. The comfortable rhythm of diplomatic negotiation and limited warfare that had characterized international relations for centuries was being replaced by something far more ruthless and absolute. The Assyrians represented a new kind of empire, one that sought not merely tribute and acknowledgement from its neighbors, but complete subordination. Their armies moved with mechanical precision, employing siege techniques that could reduce the mightiest fortress to rubble, and practicing a form of psychological warfare that sought to break the spirit of resistance before the first arrow was fired. They had transformed war from a seasonal activity conducted according to ancient codes of honor into a year-round profession pursued with scientific methodicity. The first serious clashes between Elam and Assyria occurred during the reign of Sennacherib, that ambitious king who rebuilt Nineveh into the wonder of the age. These early conflicts followed patterns that both sides understood: raids and counter-raids, the siege of border cities, the careful dance of alliance and betrayal that had governed international relations for centuries. Neither side yet realized that they were beginning a conflict that would ultimately consume one of them entirely. The Elamite response to these initial Assyrian probes revealed both the strengths and weaknesses that would determine their ultimate fate. Their traditional military advantages, intimate knowledge of the terrain, the fierce loyalty of mountain warriors, the mobility that came from generations of experience in hill warfare, served them well in defensive campaigns. When Assyrian armies ventured too far into the Zagros foothills, they often found themselves harassed by enemies who could appear and disappear like morning mist, striking at supply lines and isolated units before melting back into landscapes they knew like the contours of their own hands. Yet the Elamites also revealed a fatal weakness that would prove increasingly costly as the conflict intensified. Their political system, which had served them so well during the centuries of expansion and cultural flowering, was not well adapted to the kind of sustained, total warfare that the Assyrians were prepared to wage. The loose confederation of cities and regions that made up the Elamite Empire could act with remarkable effectiveness when their interests were aligned. But they lacked the centralized command structure that could coordinate resistance against an enemy who fought with the unity of a single, terrible will. The pattern of conflict began to change dramatically during the reign of Esarhaddon, Sennacherib's successor, who brought to the Assyrian throne a strategic vision that went far beyond his predecessor's regional ambitions. Esarhaddon understood that lasting security for Assyria required not merely the defeat of Elam, but its complete elimination as an independent power. The wars that followed would be conducted with a ruthlessness that shocked even the hardened veterans of previous campaigns. The Elamite king Teuman, who ruled during this period of escalating conflict, embodied both the nobility and the tragic limitations of his civilization's response to the Assyrian challenge. A warrior of undoubted courage and a ruler who commanded genuine loyalty from his people, Teuman nonetheless found himself fighting a kind of war for which neither he nor his ancestors had prepared. The ancient traditions of leadership that had served Elam so well in times of peace and limited conflict proved inadequate to the demands of total war. The decisive phase of the conflict began when Ashurbanipal ascended to the Assyrian throne, bringing with him a combination of military genius and implacable determination that would prove fatal to Elamite independence. Ashurbanipal understood that Elam represented the greatest remaining threat to Assyrian hegemony, and he was prepared to dedicate whatever resources were necessary to eliminate that threat permanently. The campaigns that followed were marked by a level of systematic destruction that was unprecedented even by the harsh standards of ancient warfare. The Assyrians began by targeting not only Elamite military forces, but also the economic and cultural infrastructure that sustained Elamite civilization. Trade routes were severed, agricultural areas were systematically devastated, and cities that had flourished for centuries were reduced to smoking ruins. The psychological impact of these campaigns was perhaps even more devastating than their immediate material effects. The Assyrians understood that breaking the spirit of resistance required more than military victory. It demanded the systematic humiliation of everything that a people held sacred. Temples were desecrated, royal tombs were violated, and cultural treasures that had been preserved for generations were carried off to Nineveh as trophies of conquest. The Battle of the Ulai River stands as one of the most significant and tragic encounters in this prolonged conflict. Here, the Elamite king was defeated on the banks of the Ulai. Elam was ravaged and much spoil taken. The defeat was more than a military setback. It represented the shattering of Elamite confidence in their ability to resist Assyrian power through traditional means. Teuman, the brave king who had struggled so valiantly to preserve his people's independence, met his death in this battle, and with him died something essential about Elamite resistance. The detailed accounts that Assyrian scribes preserved of this engagement reveal not only the tactical superiority of their forces, but also their deliberate attempt to break the psychological foundation of Elamite nationalism. The aftermath of Teuman's defeat saw the beginning of a systematic campaign to erase Elamite identity itself. Ashurbanipal installed several vassal kings, such as Tamaritu, although these quickly broke off relations with Assyria over their pillages. The Assyrian strategy of ruling through puppet monarchs failed because it underestimated the deep cultural roots of Elamite independence. Even kings who owed their thrones to Assyrian support found it impossible to maintain legitimacy while collaborating with foreign occupiers who were systematically destroying the civilization they were supposed to govern. The cycle of rebellion and repression that followed Teuman's death created a spiral of violence that consumed both sides. Each Elamite uprising was met with increasingly severe Assyrian retaliation, while each Assyrian atrocity strengthened the resolve of those who still resisted. The conflict had moved beyond rational calculation of political advantage into the realm of existential struggle where compromise was no longer possible. The final phase of this tragic confrontation began in the late 640s, when Ashurbanipal sensed an opportunity to devastate Elam. The Assyrian king had finally solved the logistical challenges that had previously limited his ability to project power deep into Elamite territory. With supply lines secured and his armies freed from other commitments, he was prepared to launch the kind of comprehensive campaign that would settle the question of Elamite independence once and for all. In 646, BC, Ashurbanipal devastated Susiana with ease and sacked Susa. The destruction of Susa, that ancient jewel of Elamite civilization, marked not merely a military victory, but a conscious attempt to erase the cultural memory of an entire people. The Assyrians destroyed the city, including its temples and palaces. Vast spoils were taken. As usual, the upper classes of the land were exiled to Assyria and other parts of the empire. The sack of Susa was conducted with a thoroughness that reveals the Assyrian understanding of what was required to eliminate Elamite resistance permanently. This was not the casual looting that had often followed ancient conquests, but rather a systematic campaign of cultural annihilation. Ashurbanipal's inscriptions claim that he completely destroyed Elam, and while this claim was exaggerated, the devastation was real enough. The temples that had served as centers of Elamite spiritual life for over 1,000 years were not merely looted, but deliberately desecrated. Ashurbanipal ended the wars by invading the region, sacking Susa, and destroying the tombs of the kings. The violation of royal burial sites was intended to break the connection between the Elamite people and their ancestral heritage, severing the spiritual bonds that had sustained their sense of identity through previous periods of political upheaval. The libraries and archives that had preserved Elamite literature, legal codes, and historical records were deliberately destroyed. Scribes and scholars who had maintained the intellectual traditions of the civilization were killed or carried off into exile. The Assyrians understood that a people's capacity for resistance depends not only on their material resources, but also on their ability to remember who they are and what they have achieved. Yet, even in the midst of this systematic destruction, the human spirit proved remarkably resilient. Stories passed down through later generations speak of small groups of survivors who managed to preserve fragments of Elamite culture in remote mountain valleys, keeping alive the old songs and stories even when the great cities lay in ruins. These testimonies to human endurance remind us that the true strength of a civilization lies not in its monuments, but in the hearts of those who carry its values forward through even the darkest times. The refugee streams that flowed out of devastated Susiana carried with them not only the immediate survivors of Assyrian brutality, but also the seeds of cultural continuity that would eventually allow Elamite traditions to find new expressions in changed circumstances. Many of these refugees were absorbed into other communities throughout the region, bringing with them skills, knowledge, and memories that would enrich their host cultures while keeping alive something essential of what had been lost. The economic disruption caused by the Assyrian campaigns extended far beyond the immediate zone of military operations. Trade networks that had connected Elam with markets from India to the Mediterranean were severed, causing ripple effects that were felt in communities that had never seen an Assyrian soldier. The agricultural systems that had sustained Elamite prosperity for centuries were deliberately destroyed, creating famines that claimed more lives than the battles themselves. The environmental impact of these campaigns also deserves attention, for the Assyrians employed scorched earth tactics that went beyond anything previously seen in the region. Irrigation systems that had been maintained for generations were systematically destroyed. Orchards were cut down, and even the seed grain needed for future plantings was carried off or destroyed. The message was clear. This land was to remain permanently uninhabitable, a monument to the futility of resistance to Assyrian power. In the immediate aftermath of Susa's destruction, it seemed as though the Assyrian goal of eliminating Elamite civilization had been achieved. The political structures that had governed the region for centuries had been shattered. The economic base that had sustained urban life had been destroyed, and the cultural institutions that had preserved Elamite identity had been systematically dismantled. Yet history would prove more complex than Ashurbanipal's triumphal inscriptions suggested. While the independent Elamite state had indeed been eliminated, the people themselves proved more resilient than their conquerors had expected. In the remote valleys of the Zagros, in the scattered communities of refugees who had found shelter in distant lands, and in the memories of survivors who had witnessed the destruction, something of Elam's spirit survived. The irony of the Assyrian victory was that it came at the very moment when their own empire was beginning to show signs of the internal strain that would eventually lead to its collapse. The resources that had been devoted to the conquest of Elam might have been better used to address the growing challenges that threatened Assyrian power from other directions. In achieving their goal of destroying Elam, the Assyrians had also weakened themselves in ways that would prove fatal within a few decades of their triumph. As we stand in the gathering twilight that follows this great catastrophe, we sense the profound sadness that accompanies the end of any civilization. Yet we also detect the stirring of new possibilities, for the destruction of the old order created space for different forms of political and cultural organization to emerge. The story of Elam was ending, but the story of the people who had been Elamites was entering a new chapter. The smoke rising from the ruins of Susa carried with it not only the ash of destroyed buildings, but also the dreams and aspirations of countless generations who had lived and worked and loved in that ancient city. Yet even as we mourn what was lost, we can begin to sense the subtle movements that would eventually lead to transformation and renewal. For in the great cycle of history, destruction and creation are not opposites, but rather complementary aspects of the eternal process through which human societies adapt to changing circumstances. The eagles of Elam had indeed fallen from the sky, their proud flight brought to an end by the superior force of Assyrian arms. But in the quiet valleys where survivors gathered to tend their wounds and remember their dead, new dreams were already beginning to take shape. Dreams that would eventually find expression in the rise of new powers and the emergence of new forms of civilization that would honor the memory of what had been while adapting to the realities of what must come. And now, as the last echoes of this great tragedy fade into the silence of historical memory, we prepare to follow the currents of time toward the next chapter of our journey, where we will discover how the remnants of Elamite culture found new expressions under foreign rule, and how the spirit of this ancient people proved more durable than the political structures that had once contained it. From the ashes of destruction, like the mythical phoenix of ancient legend, something new and unexpected began to emerge from the ruins of Elamite civilization. As our journey carries us beyond the darkest chapter in Elam's story, we find ourselves witnessing one of history's most remarkable transformations. Not the simple conquest of one people by another, but the subtle resurrection of an ancient culture within the embrace of a new and greater empire. The winds of change that swept across the Iranian plateau in the middle of the 6th century, before the Common Era, brought with them the sound of different voices, the rhythm of different drums. From the highlands of Fars, a region that had long existed on the periphery of Elamite influence, came a people whose destiny would reshape the entire known world. These were the Persians, and their leader bore the name that would echo through the ages: Cyrus, called by history the Great. Yet as we observe this moment of transition, we must remember that history is never as simple as the victory of conqueror over conquered. The Persian Empire that emerged under Cyrus and his successors was not built upon the ashes of previous civilizations, but rather upon their living inheritance. What made the Achaemenid Empire so remarkable was not its military might alone, but its genius for incorporating the wisdom, traditions, and administrative skills of the peoples it encompassed. Imagine, if you will, the first Persian administrators arriving in the ruins of Susa, that ancient city that had once been the crown jewel of Elamite civilization. What they found was not merely a collection of broken stones and abandoned buildings, but the remnants of one of the world's most sophisticated governmental systems. The Elamites, across their long history, had developed administrative techniques, legal traditions, and cultural practices that the Persians were wise enough to recognize as valuable assets rather than obstacles to be swept away. The transformation of Susa under Persian rule illustrates the remarkable pragmatism that characterized Achaemenid governance. Rather than imposing a purely Persian identity upon this ancient center, Cyrus and his successors chose to restore and rebuild, creating a city that honored both its Elamite heritage and its new role as a center of Persian administration. The palaces that rose from the rubble incorporated architectural elements from both traditions, creating a unique fusion that would influence building styles throughout the empire. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this cultural synthesis was the continued importance of the Elamite language itself. During the reign of Cyrus II and Darius IV, and as long as the seat of government was still at Susa in Elam, the language of the chancellery was Elamite. This is primarily attested in the Persepolis fortification and treasury tablets that reveal details of the day-to-day functioning of the empire. This was not merely a matter of practical convenience, though the survival of Elamite scribes with their specialized knowledge certainly made administrative continuity easier to maintain. More significantly, the Persian decision to preserve Elamite as an official language of imperial administration represented a recognition that effective governance required cultural sensitivity and respect for local traditions. Beyond the heartland cities of Persepolis and Susa, where Elamite was widely in use, Aramaic had been the principal bureaucratic language of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. But in the ancient heartland of Elam, the language of Inshushinak and Kiririsha continued to serve the daily business of empire. This linguistic continuity provided a bridge between the Elamite past and the Persian present, allowing the accumulated wisdom of centuries to flow into the administrative practices of the new order. The Persian approach to incorporating Elamite administrative practices reveals a sophistication that distinguished their empire from earlier conquering powers. Rather than attempting to govern through pure force or by imposing alien systems upon unwilling populations, the Achaemenids understood that lasting stability could only be achieved by building upon existing foundations of legitimate authority and cultural identity. In the great palace complex at Persepolis, that wonder of the ancient world that Darius the Merkin constructed as the ceremonial heart of his empire, we can observe the fruits of this cultural synthesis. The magnificent reliefs that decorated the walls of the audience halls depicted not only Persian nobles and Persian customs, but representatives from all the diverse peoples who comprised the empire, each shown in their traditional dress and bearing their characteristic gifts to the great king. Among these carved figures, careful observers can identify elements that clearly derive from Elamite artistic traditions. The particular way of representing flowing robes, the stylized treatment of vegetation, the subtle conventions for depicting divine blessing that had been developed in Elamite workshops over many centuries. The Persian artists who created these masterworks were not merely copying foreign styles, but rather weaving together diverse cultural threads to create something entirely new, yet deeply rooted in ancient traditions. The religious synthesis that occurred during this period was equally remarkable. The Persians, followers of Zoroaster's teachings about the cosmic struggle between light and darkness, did not attempt to suppress the ancient deities of Elam. Instead, they found ways to honor both Ahura Mazda, their supreme god of light and wisdom, and the traditional protectors of Elamite cities and regions. In Shushanak, the ancient guardian of Susa continued to receive offerings and prayers, though now these were often accompanied by invocations of Persian deities as well. The great temples that had been destroyed during the Assyrian campaigns were rebuilt, but their new forms reflected the architectural influences of both cultures. The result was a religious landscape that provided continuity with the past while adapting to the spiritual insights of the present. This religious tolerance was not merely a matter of political expediency, though it certainly served practical purposes by reducing the likelihood of religious rebellion. More fundamentally, it reflected the Persian understanding that divine truth might manifest itself in different forms among different peoples, and that wisdom could be found in the accumulated spiritual experience of many cultures. The economic revival that occurred under Persian rule demonstrated the material benefits of this policy of cultural synthesis. The trade networks that had been shattered during the final conflicts between Elam and Assyria were rebuilt and extended, connecting the Persian Gulf with markets that stretched from India to the Black Sea. Elamite merchants, drawing upon generations of commercial experience, became important intermediaries in this expanded system of international trade. The agricultural techniques that had sustained Elamite civilization for centuries were preserved and improved. The complex irrigation systems that had been destroyed during the wars were rebuilt using both traditional Elamite engineering knowledge and new techniques developed in other parts of the empire. The result was a level of agricultural productivity that exceeded even what had been achieved during Elam's Golden Age. The Persian administrative system, while maintaining overall unity of purpose and direction, allowed for considerable regional variation in methods and practices. Local governors, many of whom were drawn from established Elamite noble families, were expected to maintain order and collect taxes, but they were given considerable latitude in how they accomplished these goals. This flexibility allowed Elamite administrative traditions to continue functioning within the larger framework of imperial governance. The legal system that evolved in the Persian Empire provides another example of successful cultural integration. Persian law, with its emphasis on truth-telling and the cosmic struggle between good and evil, was blended with Elamite legal traditions that emphasized community harmony and the protection of the vulnerable. The result was a legal framework that drew strength from both sources while serving the practical needs of an increasingly complex and diverse society. One of the most remarkable aspects of this cultural synthesis was the role played by Elamite women in the new order. The Persian Empire, like Elamite society before it, accorded considerable authority and respect to royal and noble women. Queens and princesses from both cultures played important roles in diplomatic relations, religious activities, and even military affairs. The fusion of these two traditions created opportunities for women that were exceptional by the standards of the ancient world. The educational systems that developed under Persian rule also reflected this cultural blending. Schools attached to temples and palaces taught not only Persian language and customs, but also preserved and transmitted Elamite literary traditions, historical narratives, and technical knowledge. Young scribes learned to write in multiple languages and to understand the administrative requirements of governing a multicultural empire. The artistic renaissance that flourished during this period produced works that combined Persian grandeur with Elamite subtlety and technical skill. Craftsmen working in precious metals created jewelry and vessels that drew upon design traditions from both cultures, while architects developed building techniques that incorporated the best features of Persian and Elamite construction methods. The influence of this cultural synthesis extended far beyond the borders of ancient Elam. As Persian power expanded across vast territories, the administrative and cultural practices that had been developed in the synthesis of Persian and Elamite traditions were carried to distant provinces, influencing the development of governmental and social institutions across the ancient world. The legacy of Elamite civilization under Persian rule was thus not one of simple preservation, but of creative transformation and renewal. The political independence that had been lost in the flames of Susa's destruction was replaced by a different kind of autonomy: the freedom to contribute distinctive cultural values and practices to a larger civilizational project. As we observe this remarkable transformation, we are reminded that the end of political independence does not necessarily mean the death of a culture. The Elamite people, while no longer governing themselves according to their ancient forms, found new ways to express their identity and to contribute their accumulated wisdom to the larger human community. The Persian period in Elamite history teaches us something profound about the resilience of human culture and the possibilities for creative adaptation in the face of fundamental change. Rather than simply disappearing into the larger Persian Empire, Elamite traditions found new expressions that honored the past while embracing the opportunities of the present. The evening light that now bathes the restored city of Susa carries with it the warmth of renewal rather than the harsh glare of destruction. In the courtyards of the rebuilt palaces, in the workshops where artisans practice their ancient crafts with new material and techniques, in the schools where young people learn to navigate between multiple cultural traditions, we sense the quiet satisfaction of a people who have discovered how to preserve what matters most while adapting to changed circumstances. The phoenix of Elamite culture had indeed risen from the ashes, but it wore new feathers that shimmered with colors drawn from both ancient traditions and contemporary possibilities. In this transformation, we glimpse something essential about the nature of human civilization itself: its capacity not merely to endure, but to find new forms of expression that honor the past while embracing the future. As we prepare to continue our journey through the long corridors of historical memory, we carry with us the image of Elam reborn, not as a shadow of its former self, but as something both familiar and wonderfully new, a testament to the enduring power of human adaptability and the eternal creativity of the cultural spirit. And now, as this chapter of renewal draws gently toward its close, we find ourselves moving toward the final movements of our ancient symphony, where we will discover how the Elamite legacy continued to echo through later ages, influencing civilizations that arose long after the original political structures had been forgotten, but carrying forward the eternal human values that no conquest could destroy. As we approach the twilight hour of our long journey through the corridors of Elamite history, we find ourselves standing before the great mysteries that have outlived empires and outlasted kingdoms. Here, in this gentle evening of contemplation, we encounter the profound questions that continue to whisper from the depths of time, inviting us into the eternal dialogue between the known and the unknowable that lies at the heart of all historical inquiry. The legacy of ancient Elam spreads before us like the patterns in a half-completed tapestry, some threads brilliant with the light of understanding, others disappearing into shadows that no amount of scholarly devotion has yet been able to illuminate. It is these very mysteries that make the Elamite story so compelling, for they remind us that even our most diligent efforts to understand the past must acknowledge the vast territories of human experience that remain forever beyond our reach. Among the most tantalizing of these enigmas is the Proto-Elamite script, one of humanity's earliest experiments with written communication. Dating back more than 5,000 years to around 3000 BCE, this ancient writing system represents one of our species' first attempts to capture human thought and preserve it across the generations. Yet, despite decades of scholarly effort, this script remains largely undeciphered, its secrets locked within symbols that seem to dance at the edge of comprehension. Imagine, if you will, the patient scholars who have devoted their careers to studying the more than 1,600 Proto-Elamite texts that have been discovered across Iran. These dedicated researchers, working with fragments of clay tablets and damaged inscriptions, represent a kind of intellectual archaeology, attempting to reconstruct not just the meaning of individual symbols, but the entire worldview of a civilization that vanished millennia ago. The Proto-Elamite numerical system has yielded some of its secrets, revealing mathematical concepts and record-keeping practices that show remarkable sophistication. We can glimpse, through these numerical notations, something of the economic complexity that characterized early Elamite society. Evidence of trade relationships, agricultural management, and administrative systems that were far more elaborate than anything previously imagined for such an early period in human history. Yet the non-numerical portions of these texts continue to guard their mysteries. We can observe the elegant curves and precise angles of symbols that clearly represent a sophisticated intellectual system, but we cannot hear the voices that created them. We see the careful arrangement of signs that obviously conveyed complex meanings to their original readers, but we cannot unlock the thoughts and feelings that motivated their creation. This silence speaks to something profound about the nature of historical knowledge itself. Even our most successful reconstructions of ancient civilizations represent only fragments of the full human experience that once flourished in those distant times. The Proto-Elamite script reminds us that vast libraries of human wisdom have been lost, that entire philosophical and poetic traditions have vanished, leaving barely a trace, that the great conversations that once animated Elamite society now continue only in realms beyond our hearing. The recent breakthrough in deciphering linear Elamite script, achieved by dedicated scholars working with just 43 known inscriptions, offers both hope and humility. This younger Elamite writing system, used between approximately 2300 and 1850 BCE, has begun to reveal some of its secrets through the patient work of archaeologists and linguists who have spent years analyzing every curve and line of the surviving texts. The successful partial decipherment of linear Elamite demonstrates the remarkable persistence of human curiosity and the power of collaborative scholarship. French archaeologist François de Say and his colleagues, working with inscriptions scattered across Iran and preserved in museums around the world, have managed to unlock portions of a script that had remained silent for nearly 4,000 years. Yet even this success illuminates the vastness of what remains unknown. The 43 linear Elamite inscriptions that have been discovered represent only the smallest fragment of what must once have been an extensive literature. We can imagine the chronicles and poems, the legal codes and religious texts, the business records and personal letters that were created in this script but have not survived the passage of millennia. The geographical distribution of these mysterious scripts tells its own story about the extent of Elamite influence and the complexity of ancient Iranian civilization. Proto-Elamite texts have been found not only at Susa, that great center of Elamite power, but at sites scattered across the Iranian plateau, suggesting networks of communication and administration that were far more extensive than political boundaries might suggest. This widespread distribution raises fascinating questions about the relationship between writing, power, and cultural identity in the ancient world. Were these scripts used only by elite administrators and scribes, or did literacy extend more broadly through Elamite society? How did the development of writing systems influence the evolution of Elamite religious thought, legal concepts, and artistic expression? These questions invite us into speculative territories where imagination must supplement the necessarily limited evidence provided by archaeological discovery. The mystery of Elamite linguistic origins adds another layer to our puzzle. The Elamite language belongs to no known language family, standing in splendid isolation among the great linguistic traditions of the ancient Near East. It is neither Semitic like Akkadian and Hebrew, nor Indo-European like the later Persian languages that would dominate the same geographical region. Instead, Elamite represents something unique, a linguistic experiment that flourished for millennia before gradually fading from active use. This linguistic uniqueness suggests that the Elamites may have represented one of the most ancient, continuous cultural traditions in the Iranian world, a people whose roots reached back to the very dawn of agricultural civilization in the region. Their language may preserve echoes of ways of thinking and speaking that characterized human communities in Iran long before the great migrations and conquests that would reshape the cultural landscape of the Near East. The religious traditions of Ancient Elam present their own set of compelling mysteries. While we have learned much about the major deities like Inshushinak and Kiririsha, vast territories of Elamite spiritual life remain unexplored. What were the creation myths that explained the origins of the world? What seasonal festivals marked the passage of the agricultural year? How did Elamite concepts of death and afterlife evolve over the centuries? The archaeological record provides tantalizing glimpses of ritual practices and religious beliefs, but these fragments raise as many questions as they answer. Elaborate burial goods suggest complex beliefs about the continuation of life beyond death. But we can only speculate about the specific narratives and expectations that gave meaning to these practices. Temple foundations and religious artifacts hint at sophisticated theological systems, but the prayers and hymns that once echoed through Elamite sanctuaries have been lost to time. The artistic legacy of Elam poses similar puzzles. The magnificent metalwork, the intricate stone carvings, the elaborate architectural decorations that have survived from the height of Elamite civilization demonstrate technical skills and aesthetic sensibilities of the highest order. Yet, we can only guess at the cultural meanings that these artistic achievements carried for their original creators and audiences. What stories were told about the figures depicted in Elamite sculpture? What symbolic meanings were encoded in the decorative patterns that adorned palace walls and temple facades? How did artistic styles evolve in response to changing political circumstances and cultural influences? These questions invite us to imagine the rich cultural conversations that once surrounded the creation and appreciation of Elamite art. The legacy of Elam in later Iranian civilization presents another fascinating area of inquiry. We know that Elamite administrative practices influenced the development of Persian governmental systems, and that Elamite artistic traditions contributed to the distinctive aesthetic of Achaemenid imperial art. But the full extent of this cultural continuity remains to be explored. How many Elamite words survived into later Persian languages, carrying with them concepts and ways of understanding the world that had originated in much earlier periods? What agricultural techniques, architectural methods, and craft traditions passed from Elamite communities to their Persian successors? How did Elamite religious ideas influence the development of Zoroastrianism and other Iranian spiritual traditions? The answers to these questions are gradually emerging through the patient work of scholars who combine archaeological evidence with linguistic analysis and comparative cultural studies. But each new discovery seems to reveal the existence of additional layers of complexity and connection that extend our understanding while simultaneously expanding the territories of acknowledged mystery. The influence of Elamite civilization extended far beyond the boundaries of the Iranian plateau. Trade relationships connected Elam with communities from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean, creating networks through which not only goods, but also ideas and artistic influences flowed in all directions. The full mapping of these connections remains an ongoing project that reveals new dimensions of ancient globalization. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to reshape our understanding of Elamite society and its place in the broader context of ancient Near Eastern civilization. Excavations at sites that were once considered peripheral to Elamite culture have revealed evidence of sophisticated urban planning, complex administrative systems, and artistic achievements that challenge previous assumptions about the extent and nature of Elamite influence. These discoveries remind us that our knowledge of ancient Elam is still evolving, that each season of archaeological fieldwork has the potential to overturn established interpretations and open new avenues of inquiry. The patient work of excavation and analysis continues to resurrect voices that have been silent for millennia, adding new chapters to the ongoing conversation between past and present. The digital revolution has brought new tools to the study of Elamite mysteries. Computer analysis of undeciphered scripts, satellite mapping of ancient settlement patterns, and advanced chemical analysis of artifacts are providing insights that would have been impossible for earlier generations of scholars. These technological advances offer hope that some of the great mysteries of Elamite civilization may yet yield their secrets. Yet, even as we celebrate these methodological advances, we must acknowledge that some aspects of the Elamite experience will probably remain forever beyond our reach. The private thoughts of individuals, the casual conversations of daily life, the emotional undercurrents that motivated political decisions and artistic choices. These human dimensions of the past exist now only in the realm of informed imagination. This recognition of the limits of historical knowledge need not discourage us. Instead, it can inspire a deeper appreciation for the mystery and wonder that surround human existence itself. The Elamites, like all ancient peoples, lived lives of complete complexity and depth, experiencing love and loss, hope and fear, triumph and tragedy with the same intensity that characterizes human existence today. Their legacy lives on not only in the archaeological record and in the cultural traditions that trace their ancestry to Elamite roots, but also in the eternal human qualities that they shared with all peoples across all times. Their capacity for creating beauty, their hunger for meaning, their ability to build communities and civilizations that transcended individual lifespans. These achievements speak to possibilities that remain as relevant today as they were 4,000 years ago. The mysteries that surround ancient Elam serve as gentle reminders of the vast territories of human experience that remain to be explored. Each unanswered question points toward the infinite complexity of consciousness and culture, the endless creativity of human communities, the eternal mystery of what it means to be human in a universe that seems simultaneously familiar and utterly strange. As we stand in the gathering dusk of this long exploration, surrounded by the whispered questions that have outlived empires, we find ourselves enriched by the encounter with mystery itself. The Elamites have given us not only their partial answers, but also their enduring questions. And in that gift, we discover something precious about the nature of wisdom and the possibilities for wonder that remain eternally available to the human spirit. And now, as the last light fades from this chapter of mysteries and legacies, we prepare to gather the threads of our journey into a final contemplation, where the ancient voices of Elam will speak once more across the corridors of time, offering their blessing and their wisdom to all who have accompanied them on this long path through the landscapes of memory and dream. And so, dear companions of this long dreaming, we find ourselves at last standing in the soft twilight that follows every great journey. The path we have walked together stretches behind us like a river of memory, flowing from the misty dawn of Proto-Elamite civilization through the golden noon of imperial splendor, past the dark storm of destruction and into the gentle resurrection that came with Persian rule. Now, in this quiet hour of reflection, we gather the scattered threads of story into a final tapestry of understanding and peace. As the evening star appears above the distant peaks of the Zagros Mountains, casting its silver light upon the ancient stones of Susa, we sense the presence of all those who have walked this path before us. The whispered voices of countless generations seem to drift on the cooling air. the voices of farmers who first learned to channel the mountain streams through carefully tended fields, of craftsmen whose patient hands shaped bronze and gold into objects of enduring beauty, of scribes who pressed their thoughts into clay tablets that would speak across millennia to scholars they could never have imagined. Here, in this timeless moment between day and night, between memory and dream, we can feel the gentle pulse of continuity that connects the ancient world with our own. The Elamites may have ceased to exist as an independent people. Their political institutions may have crumbled into dust. Their cities may have been rebuilt by foreign hands. Yet something essential of their spirit continues to breathe in the evening wind that moves through the date palms and oleanders of modern Khuzestan. What was that essential something that has proven more durable than bronze, more lasting than stone? Perhaps it was their gift for finding harmony between seemingly opposing forces, between the wild freedom of the mountains and the cultivated abundance of the plains, between fierce independence and diplomatic wisdom, between reverence for ancient traditions and openness to beneficial change. In a world that often seems torn by irreconcilable differences, the Elamite example whispers of possibilities for integration and balance that remain eternally relevant. Their understanding of power, too, offers lessons that transcend the boundaries of any particular historical period. The Elamites learned to wield authority not as a crude instrument of domination, but as a sacred trust that carried obligations as well as privileges. Their rulers were expected to be guardians of justice, patrons of culture, protectors of the vulnerable. Even in their moments of greatest military triumph, they remembered that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to build and preserve. The religious sensibility that permeated Elamite civilization speaks to spiritual longings that remain as vital today as they were 4,000 years ago. Their understanding that the divine presence moves through all aspects of existence, that human dignity derives from our connection to forces greater than ourselves. That wisdom lies in living in harmony with both natural and cosmic order. These insights offer guidance for any age that struggles to find meaning in the midst of change and uncertainty. Their integration of the feminine principle into both religious and political life demonstrated an understanding of balance that many later civilizations would forget to their detriment. In honoring both Inshushinak the protector and Kiririsha the nurturer, both the masculine virtues of strength and the feminine gifts of wisdom, the Elamites created cultural forms that drew upon the full range of human potential. Queens and priestesses, mothers and craftswomen, all found respected places in a society that understood that true civilization requires the contributions of all its members. The artistic legacy of Ancient Elam continues to speak across the centuries, reminding us that beauty is not a luxury, but a necessity of the human spirit. In their bronzes and their stone carvings, their architectural innovations and their decorative arts, the Elamites demonstrated that the impulse to create beauty is as fundamental to human nature as the need for food and shelter. Their works invite us to remember that we too are called to be creators, that our own hands and minds and hearts can contribute to the eternal human project of transforming raw experience into forms that uplift and inspire. Even their mysteries serve a valuable purpose in our contemporary world. The undeciphered scripts, the partially understood religious practices, the gaps in our historical knowledge. All these remind us that human experience contains dimensions that extend beyond the reach of purely rational analysis. In an age that sometimes reduces everything to data and algorithms, the enigmas of ancient Elam preserve space for wonder, for the recognition that mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be celebrated. The story of Elam's relationship with its neighbors offers timeless lessons about the possibilities and perils of international relations. Their complex dance of alliance and rivalry with Mesopotamian powers, their ultimate incorporation into the Persian Empire, their cultural resilience even in the face of political subordination, all these historical patterns continue to echo in the contemporary world, where peoples and nations still struggle to balance independence with interdependence, cultural integrity with beneficial adaptation. As we stand here in the gathering darkness, with the first stars appearing in the clear desert sky, we can sense the continuing presence of the Elamite legacy in the world around us. It lives on in the archaeological artifacts that patient scholars continue to uncover and interpret. It persists in the cultural traditions of modern Iran, where ancient customs have been transformed by the passage of centuries, but never entirely forgotten. It endures in the genetic heritage of the peoples who still inhabit the lands between the Zagros Mountains and the Persian Gulf, carrying in their very cells the biological memories of Elamite ancestors. But perhaps most importantly, the legacy of ancient Elam lives on in the realm of human possibility, in the eternal potential for creating societies that honor both individual dignity and collective responsibility, that balance practical necessity with spiritual aspiration, that remain rooted in tradition while remaining open to transformation. Every time human beings choose cooperation over conflict, beauty over utility, wisdom over mere cleverness, something of the Elamite spirit stirs to life again. The gentle echoes that we hear in this twilight hour are not merely the sounds of a vanished past, but also the whispered promises of futures yet to be created. The children who will be born tomorrow, the communities that will be built in years to come, the works of art and literature and music that will emerge from human creativity. All of these carry within themselves the possibility of embodying the same values that made Elamite civilization worthy of our admiration and study. And so, as our long journey together draws toward its close, we find that we are not really ending, but rather beginning. The story we have shared has prepared us to recognize the continuing presence of ancient wisdom in contemporary experience, to see the eternal patterns that connect all human striving across the boundaries of time and culture. The moon that rises now above the ruins of Susa is the same moon that blessed the dreams of Elamite children 4 millennia ago. The stars that emerge in the deepening darkness are the same stars that guided Elamite merchants along the trade routes that connected the Iranian plateau with distant lands and peoples. The wind that stirs the branches of ancient trees carries with it the same life-giving breath that once filled the sails of Elamite ships venturing into the waters of the Persian Gulf. In this cosmic continuity, we find comfort and inspiration. We are not isolated fragments of consciousness adrift in an indifferent universe, but rather participants in an ongoing conversation that began with the first human voices raised in wonder at the beauty and mystery of existence. The Elamites added their own distinctive notes to this eternal symphony, and now we are called to contribute our own voices to the continuing song. As sleep begins to claim us, carrying us gently into the realm of dreams where all times exist simultaneously, and all places are equally near. We carry with us the blessing of having walked for a while in the footsteps of these remarkable people. Their courage in the face of overwhelming challenges, their creativity in transforming raw materials into objects of beauty, their wisdom in creating social forms that honored both individual worth and collective well-being. All these gifts have become part of our own inheritance. The Elamite story teaches us that every ending is also a beginning, that every conclusion opens onto new possibilities. As their civilization was transformed rather than simply destroyed, as their cultural contributions continued to enrich later societies even after their political independence had been lost, so too our own efforts to understand and learn from their example will continue to bear fruit in ways we cannot now imagine. In the morning, when we wake refreshed from our dreaming, we will carry with us something precious that we did not possess before, a deeper appreciation for the resilience of human culture, a clearer understanding of the values that make civilizations worthy of preservation, a stronger sense of connection to the great chain of being that links us with all who have lived and all who will live upon this ancient earth. The gentle echoes of Elam will continue to reverberate through our thoughts and actions, reminding us that we too are called to be builders of civilizations, creators of beauty, guardians of wisdom. And in fulfilling that calling, we honor not only the memory of those who have gone before, but also the hopes of those who will come after. Rest now, dear companions of this journey. Let the peace that comes with completed understanding settle over your spirit, like the soft darkness that embraces the sleeping earth. The story of ancient Elam has been told, but the story of human possibility continues, and in that continuing story, illuminated by the gentle light of ancient wisdom, we each have our own precious part to play. Sleep well and dream of mountains and rivers, of bronze and gold, of languages yet to be deciphered and civilizations yet to be built. Dream of the eternal conversation between past and future, between memory and hope, between what was and what might yet be. And know that in your dreaming, the gentle echoes of Elam continue their eternal song, blessing all who have ears to hear and hearts to understand. The evening star keeps its faithful watch above the ruins of Susa, and all is well in the universe of memory and dream. All is well, and all shall be well in the continuing story of humankind upon this beautiful and mysterious earth.